So hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being in the room today here in Ottawa, and welcome to those who are joining by live stream as well. My name is Christine Micah, and I'm an improvement lead with the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement. I would like to welcome you all here today. And I'm pleased to be joined by the co-chair for the meeting, Mallory Keller. And Mallory is the Patient Engagement and Empowerment Platform Lead at Health Quality Saskatchewan. And I'm so thrilled that she's here today, as we feel like Saskatchewan's been a real leader for talking about family presence and recognizing family members not as visitors, but as partners in care. So I'm up here today right now to just do a few logistics in terms of welcome. The first is that washrooms are, if you leave the conference center and go to your right, you will run into the men's washroom, and the women's is on the far side of the elevator bay. So out, turn right. We do have Wi-Fi, and I see that there's a password. Make sure that the exclamation mark is included in the password. And I would also like to point out that there are a few CFHI resource people here as well. If you're from CFHI, could you please stand up to let people know that you're in the room? There are some resource people. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let us know. Thank you. And as I've alluded to, we are live streaming parts of today. Please consult your agenda to see which portions are live streamed. And we have already sent out consent forms, and those have been, we have received your permission, so thank you for that if you filled that out online. If you have any questions about the live stream, please see Kim here at the front. She's our communications specialist, so thanks for that. And without further ado, I would like to pass things over to Elder Albert Dumont. Again, I'm thrilled that you're here, Albert, to provide us with some spiritual guidance and ground us in the intentions of the day today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Christine. Before I offer words of a prayer and welcoming, I'd like to tell you some of my experience in the city of Ottawa over the course of the last 30 years, I guess. And it has, I think it's connected to the purpose of this conference. Part of the work that I do in Ottawa has to do with helping people cross over. I do that as a volunteer, and it's dawned on me many times that in this life, there's some people who haven't had much peace in their life. And if ever a human being should be at peace, it should be whenever they're on their deathbed. If ever there was a time, no matter what turmoil and anguish or whatever that they experienced over the course of their life, they should be at peace on their deathbed. But that hasn't been the case, though, for many of our people. By the way, I've helped white people cross over, too. I've been called to the hospice here, Maycourt Hospice, to help white people, too, who've requested an Indigenous spiritual advisor to help them understand what's going on, and what, to find peace in their last days or last weeks of life. Sometimes people are even in denial that death is just hours or a couple of days away. I know at one time there was a lady, and her family just couldn't bear to tell her that she was going to die. She had less than 48 hours to live, and here she was making plans to go berry picking, and she had only met me about a week before, and she asked me if I'd go berry picking with her. And we've done that since, though, spiritually, because I love berry picking. And the thing is, though, that I felt bad for her that she didn't know. She thought she was going to recover and go on to have a life again. Sometimes people they'll say that their loved one that's dying is in panic mode about it. And that's not the case. The person that's dying is okay with it. They're brave. It's the family, though. They're the ones that are panicking because they don't know how they're going to cope when that loved one is gone. And they're saying the loved one is the one that's in panic mode when all the time it's them. I've seen that. There's times too whenever people, they're frightened. Whenever I first meet them, they're crying, and they're clinging to my arm and saying, "Help me, I don't want to die." But, after a few visits, they start to understand that there's nothing to fear, if you've lived a life and this thing of, a sickness gets a hold of you and you're not going to survive it. You have to, I always say never give up. That's one thing I'm known for, I think, in this territory, is telling people to never give up. And and I never give up myself. But whenever there's it's it's going to happen, well, then you should accept it for sure. I think I'd like you to know too that 27 and a half years ago, I guess it was, I had a bad accident and I fell over 43 feet and I had a lot of injuries. I was a stonemason bricklayer by trade, and I was up on the roof of a grist mill on a tower section of scaffolding when the roof buckled for some reason and the scaffolding collapsed. So I thought it was the end of my life, but I wasn't afraid. I just went, wow, I never thought I'd die like this. And then a thought flashed through my mind that if I landed on my feet, well, then maybe I wouldn't die. And that's what I did. I landed on my feet. But I crushed vertebrae in my back. I cracked vertebrae, and I cracked my spine above and below the damaged vertebrae. Did some bad damage to one of my ankles and one of my heels. And I had 4 inches of collapsed nerve in my left arm. And the nerve specialist at the Civic Hospital, Dr. Preston, said that my arm would never recover. But it did. So I like to tell people not to give up. And, if there's somebody there telling you don't have a chance, well, if you believe that, well, then you don't have a chance, do you? But if you have a strong will and strong of spirit, well, then you could, you have a chance to recover. So I live with chronic pain, but I don't let chronic pain rob me of life. I do a physical exercise every morning to psych myself up for the day. I don't take no medication or anything like that. I start my day off with a prayer, limber up spiritually, physically. I've volunteered because of my accident and because of the fact that I wasn't killed or paralyzed. I didn't want to say to a Creator, thank you that I wasn't killed or paralyzed. I want to do an action, to signal to the spirit land that how serious and how happy I was that things weren't worse for me. So I volunteered at St. Vincent's Hospital for 9 years, and there was a Cree man there, and he fell only 26 feet, and he broke his neck, so he was paralyzed from the neck down. And he was never bitter about his predicament. He wanted to live. He made me power of attorney over his affairs, and he didn't have an estate or anything like that. He just said to me, never let them pull the plug on me. And, he enjoyed food and jokes and things like this. He's normal, except that his body didn't work. But I saw some things at the hospital because he was from Moose Factory and he was a young man. I met him when he was 35 and he died a couple of months from being 44. And there was, family presence would have really helped out with him. And by the way, that's why he wanted to live. He wanted to live because there was something that happened between his mom and his brother and his 2 sisters, and they were estranged from his life. And he didn't want to die till there was peace in the family. And about 9 months before he died, that there was peace in the family, and they came back into his life, and we had a feast, and he had a giveaway, and then he passed away happily after. So Mike was a really good guy. I volunteered they contracted me to do some work at the Forensic Mental Health Center in Brockville. And there was a lady there from Saskatchewan. Maybe you heard of her. Her name was Marlene Carter. And Marlene Carter has a severe mental illness. And they brought her from Saskatchewan to Ontario. And Marlene didn't want to come to Ontario. She wanted to stay in Saskatchewan. And whenever she was here, because family, and that was her home. Saskatchewan was her home. She didn't want to be in Ontario. And because of her mental illness, and the way her mind was working was that if she assaulted somebody, well, then they would say, we don't want her in Ontario, and send her back to Saskatchewan. So that's what she did. She assaulted a nurse. Somebody was careless and left a pen beside her. She took the pen and stabbed the nurse in the neck with it. So maybe you heard all this in the news. It's been on the news quite a bit. But if family would have been there, I don't think that would have happened. I know that for me too, whenever I was recovering from my accident, I wasn't nice to be around because, I don't think you could describe the pain of a broken back, crushed vertebrae, and cracked vertebrae, and a cracked spine, and whatever other injuries I had. So sometimes we need somebody that's able to say, you're going to survive this. You're going to pull through it, and that's the benefits of having family nearby. When my mother was dying, it was important for me to be there. My mother was there whenever I drew my first breath of life, and I wanted to be there when she drew her last. So I stayed by her bedside 18, 20 hours a day. And for the last 3 weeks or so, she wasn't very conscious, but it was really rugged about a month before that because she was in a lot of pain. She had blood clots, and she was wanting death every day. She'd say, I just want to die. I want this pain to end. And I got to say that I've got brothers and sisters, but nobody else had the strength to be there with her. And I did. And, it was hard to take. It really was. So family helps out, and you need somebody. If you're in pain, excruciating pain, it really is to have somebody sitting beside you that loves you. I want to tell you about another experience, and I had severe addiction issues, and I celebrated 29 years of sobriety on April the 8th last spring, and that's really saying something for somebody like me, because whenever it comes to addictions, and you have, there's severe addictions, and then there's just plain old addiction. And if you're in the grips of severe addiction, you're really lucky whenever you can pull away from it. So I had severe addiction issues, and I got free of it. I guess I want to say how proud I am that I was able to conquer that addiction. But before that, though, whenever I was, I guess you could say I was a hopeless case. A lot of people thought I was, and I didn't care whether I lived or died. And sometimes I tell people, I went on a drunk when I was 15, and I never sobered up from it till 1988. It's in 1965 I went on a drunk, and always whenever I got married, and my wife and I she was pregnant with a baby girl, and whenever she was 6 months pregnant, her water broke, and we went to the hospital, and they said that the baby wouldn't have survived anyways. The baby was only 1.5 pounds in weight, and they told us that they would dispose of the body. And I want you to know how much I regret it. That ever since we just walked away from the hospital and we left our little girl there. And many times if I wouldn't have, a friend of mine had a similar experience and in Pembroke, Ontario, and she asked me, she says, Albert, could you drive me up to a funeral we're having? My daughter's, it was the same kind of thing, her daughter had a baby when she was 6 months pregnant and the baby didn't live. And I said I'd be very happy to join you because I was able to grieve. It was like my ceremony, that I should have had for my little girl. But family would have been so good, somebody to advise, somebody older that could have said, you need to do what's right here. This is not garbage here. This is a human being. It's your blood and it's your flesh and blood and your bloodline here. And let's do the honorable thing. So that stuff like that is it's whenever we talk about family presence and with the mentally ill and the paralyzed and the very sick. And whatever they're in a hospital or a home somewhere or a hospice, you got to have family there. And it's about time, there should be training for people that help people cross over, somebody that's got a knack for it. And because it's just think about it. You just need to think about it, and you will know that how you need that yourself, how you'd want that for yourself, right? So I want you to know that I'm going to be here all day, and if anybody wants to have talk to me about something that I said, and you want me to elaborate on it, or you want to, so any question you have concerning Indigenous peoples and healthcare and family, and I think I'll be able to help you out with it. I'm going to offer words of a prayer now, and first I'll tell you about the prayer. There's years ago I was invited to a fasting ceremony with the Temagami First Nations, and there was going to be a 4-day and 4-night ceremony, and whenever you go without food and water for 4 days and 4 nights, and what you do is you go deep enough into the forest that you don't hear or see technology anymore. You don't smell it, you don't taste it. You want to be far away from technology because you want to be at a place that existed before technology existed. And you mark out a circle with tobacco, and you sit in the center of the circle and you don't move from it for 4 days and 4 nights. And so I was invited to do that. I've done that ceremony many times, and every spring and every autumn I do the ceremony. I'll be doing it again in October, except now I don't do it for 4 days and 4 nights. It's more like 60 or 70 hours. And so I went up to Temagami, and their reserve is an island. It's only about a mile long. And what happens is there's a taxi, there's a boat, and they'll take you to the reserve. So I went to the reserve, and I was told that we'd be meeting at the community hall. So I didn't know where the community hall was. And so I'm walking down this dirt road, and I came to a house, and I knocked on the door, and there was an old man named Bill Twain who answered the door, and he was a Second World War veteran. And he told me he was having a bad day that day because he had a shrapnel still in his knee from being in the front lines during the Second World War. So that's how I got to know Bill Twain, and he passed this prayer along. Like, he wasn't known as an elder, to do ceremonies and things like that, but he had this prayer, and his prayer, it's a beautiful prayer. And I don't know about anybody else's spiritual beliefs here, but I do know that I don't know how you'll react to it physically, but I know spiritually you're going to love this prayer because it's real. And Bill Twain left it, And by the way, prayer is not something we're expected to do whenever a doctor tells us that we've been stricken with cancer or a loved one has been stricken with some kind of deadly illness, you know. Sometimes people, they think, well, that's when they got to start praying. It's a good way to start the day, you know, with a prayer. You just, it only takes, if you could just say a short prayer, Creator, I'm so grateful for the health of my family. And that's a prayer. And you've started your day that way. Or you could do a prayer that lasts 5 minutes or whatever the case. But this prayer is a good prayer. So I'll just say that prayer and just stay seated, and I hope you connect. I want to say that a good spirit mi numanido, how grateful we are for everything that Creator has placed in our homelands that help human beings to live well. We acknowledge and honor every tree, river, lake, and stream. We acknowledge and honor every bird, animal, fish, and all the good human beings. We're grateful for all those things in the sky world and all those things that live beneath the surface of the earth. We're grateful, too, for the bees and all the other insects that help the plants to grow. We're grateful for our ability to prepare ourselves spiritually for that spirit world that will begin when the short physical life ends. We're grateful for our ability to bring peace and comfort to one another during times of troubles and times of anguish. We ask you now, good spirit, to fill this space with your blessings and to touch each of us with the wisdom of our Anishinaabe ancestors. We ask that there will be good words spoken at this conference, strong words that will impact all of us emotionally and spiritually. We ask for blessings for these good people who traveled here from other territories. We ask that if there's anyone here who has a relative who is suffering somehow, whether from things of addiction or from depression or some kind of physical sickness, we ask that that relative will have a good day today, and that relative will return soon to the family as a role model and as a mentor. We ask these things of you, good spirit, because of the great respect we have for everything that Creator has made. I know we're going to have a good day. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Albert. Those are great words to inspire us as we move forward today. So we're going to continue with the same kind of spirit. We're going to have a family advisor, Darlene Dick from Saskatchewan, come and talk about her and her husband's experience with Open Family Presence before we knew it as Open Family Presence. And, you know, really, Darlene's story inspired Saskatchewan to think about how do you use positive experiences to reinforce behavior. And so that's what we're going to hear about in the next little while. As we're going through that, Darlene, please come up. Just note that we're going to use the term patient throughout the sessions over the next 2 days. But please do not be offended. The term patient is all-encompassing, includes clients, residents, caregivers, family members, can include friends, etc. So please use the term that really resonates with you, what makes you feel comfortable, and respect those as they also choose the word that has meaning for them. So, Darlene.
Yeah, my name is Darlene Dick, and I'm a patient advisor from Saskatchewan. And it is a real privilege for me to be able to attend and contribute to these, thank you, roundtable discussions on very important issues surrounding family presence. I'll just speak very briefly of what led me to become a patient advisor. My husband, Steve, as you can see in the photo here, was diagnosed with kidney cancer in 2009, and we then began a 4-year journey through our provincial health system. And we both experienced a lot during those years, him as a patient and myself as a family member alongside. We were always together. One of our doctors even referred to us as Team Dick. And during this time, an ad asking for volunteer patient reps appeared in our local paper, and I thought I could give something to this, and I had my husband's full support to do so. Sadly, he passed away in the fall of 2013, but I still wanted to contribute, and now I feel it's in his honor. I also want to let all of you know that I appreciate and have deep regard for those of you who have devoted your careers to health care. Bless you for sharing your gift of care. And I just want to preface this next part by saying through all of our hospital stays, I was very conscious and respectful. My husband and my family tried to be very respectful of staying out of the nurse's way and, just making things as easy as possible, not only for my husband but also for the staff. It was just something that was very important to me. I didn't want to be asked to leave, for sure not, and I wanted to be as easy to have around and almost that they wouldn't notice me there if that was possible. Because as you know, when this journey started in 2009, Saskatchewan didn't really have an open presence policy as such. So we were very fortunate that the hospitals that we stayed in, and there was 3 different ones in our province, all allowed me to stay with my husband. Okay, so several years ago I wrote a short essay of our experience, and I'd like to read that to you at this time. And it's called Because I Was Always There. My personal experience involves my husband Steve's 4-year cancer journey as a patient. We were hospitalized 6 times in those 4 years for a total of 8 weeks. During those 8 weeks, I was never away from him for even an entire morning or afternoon, and I spent every single evening and night with him. I say we were hospitalized because that's how it felt. We were a team. I will always be forever grateful for the privilege and the opportunity of staying with him. Although a hospital is often the last place a person wants to be, there is no place on earth I would have rather been for those days and nights. The tears, the laughter, the conversations, the time watching him sleep even are all my forever treasures. Because I was always there, I was able to expand on his answer of fine when asked by staff how he was doing. Maybe he forgot to mention his leg was a little swollen, his appetite was gone, his breathing was more difficult, or he was in a little more pain than usual. Because I was always there and taking notes and keeping a journal, he could rest while the staff made their rounds, as I could answer their questions many times. Because I was always there and kept a medical binder with me with copies of every lab test, procedure report, results, doctor's notes, blood pressure charts, medication charts, etc. I was able to save the doctor's time because I could produce any piece of information at any given moment, and I actually did that on several occasions. Because I was always there, we caught more than one clinical error and mistake that could have and would have impacted his care. Because I was always there, I was able to divert visitors and even cleaning staff sometimes and ask them to come back a little later so he'd be able to keep resting. Because I was always there and had lots of time, I could change his bedding, clothes, get his water, his snacks, his warm blankets. Okay, the odd time I got a few of those warm blankets for myself. But I got him what he needed, and he never needed to bother the nurses with such things. So important to us. Because I was always there, his dignity was preserved, as it was me who helped him with all his personal needs right until his last day. And most special of all, because I was always there, I was able to hold my beloved's hand the whole night and hear the 3 things he said to me in the middle of his last night on earth. I am so very grateful that I was there. All right. So I'm just going to end this speaking right from the heart. We were married 29 years, and I wrote this. We had a blog throughout this journey, and I was looking at that the other day, and one of the statements that I wrote stood out at me, and I said, "The one who always protected me, I now feel very protective of," and I just want. And now Saskatchewan has adopted this open presence policy, and I just want to say how grateful I am that this policy allowed me to feel like I was protecting and doing the best I could for him. And so these are just a few examples of when we were in the hospital, our kids would come and bring us Tim Hortons coffee in the morning, and that was just a great little time that we had there, enjoying coffee. This was actually taken the day before he passed away, and I was helping him with something. I think he couldn't eat at that point, and I was helping him, and he looked at me and he goes, "Dar, you're," how did he say this? "You're even cuter when I'm dopey," I think is what he said. And I twisted his ear at that point. This was his birthday, which was 3 days before he passed away, actually. My daughter, my son, her husband, and his mother were in the hospital room, and that was so special. We're farmers, grain farmers in Saskatchewan, and our kids wanted to do something very special for his birthday. And so they asked 4 of his closest friends, and which were a couple friends of ours, to shut down their combines at 8 o'clock in the evening and come into the hospital and just say hello to him. And that's what happened. And am I getting close to my time? Okay. And it was just a great birthday for him, for sure. He actually wandered out of the room himself at that point. He hadn't been getting up for most of the day. And that was just a special night that we'll treasure. We'll come to. Friends of mine, a girlfriend of mine bought us matching pajamas for our last hospital stay. This was a photo taken the day he passed away with my son, not knowing he took this photo. It's precious to me. We got matching pajamas, and we had movie nights, as you could see with the iPad thing in there. We got a bag of popcorn, and we watched a movie together on several occasions, so that was fun. There's one of our movie nights. Popcorn must be gone by this point. And the picture, the last photo I'll speak to, is when we're all surrounding his bed. And this one here, that's our daughter showing him her wedding video. She got married 7 weeks before he passed away, and he was feeling well enough to walk her down the aisle. And it's probably the saddest picture I have. But we were able to experience that again with him in the hospital. So it's anything I can do to make you realize how much that meant, that I was allowed and to be with my husband in the hospital is something that I will continue to work towards. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. I've heard the story before, but it still brings me to tears because it just tells the power of being with your family. So I'd like everyone to close their eyes for a moment and ground yourself in the one person that you want to be there with when they're in hospital or in care, or that you want to have with you if you are the patient in your family. And just breathe through that moment for a second. See their face. You can open your eyes. Remember that person throughout the next 2 days. That's why we're all here. And that's why this policy, open family presence, needs to be adopted across Canada. That's why we're here. And I think we need to keep going back to that. It can become a lot of work, as we're going to talk about. How are we actually going to do this? How are we going to get the entire nation to really believe in eliminating those restrictive visiting hours? It's through passion. So with that, we're going to move into our meeting. And I think, Christine, you're going to talk about objectives.
Yes, thanks very much, Mallory. And we have one more welcome, and I'm very pleased that our president of the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement is here and joining us. So, Maureen, if you'd like to come up and say a few words, thank you.
Thank you very much to Albert for starting us off so well, for Darlene for centering what we're doing, and to Mallory for having us think about ourselves and about our loved ones. What we're here to do today, as Mallory and Christine have said, is to look at what looks, devoid of emotion but isn't, and that is, what's the policy framework to push what we know is truly important across the country, to do it with passion and with evidence. That's why we're here, because we believe very strongly that this must indeed happen. I was really pleased when I opened the paper this morning and saw this very good story about the BC Women's Hospital, which is opening their neonatal ICU to parents. So it was very timely, given what we're going to talk about today. We know that patient and family engagement can help transform healthcare in this country. It'll transform healthcare, not only the personal experiences, but actually, in our view, the organization of care. But we also know that many organizations struggle with meaningful engagement, and we also know that Canada fares very poorly in international comparisons of patient and family-centered care. In 2014, Commonwealth Fund statistics showed that Canada ranked 8 out of 11 countries in patient and family-centered care. Since 2010, here, we at CFHI have led a series of pan-Canadian initiatives that have supported 44 healthcare teams in harnessing the potential of patients and families to help drive improvement. And also in 2014, we signed on as Canadian partners for the Better Together Partnering with Patients and Families campaign started by the Institute for Patient and Family-Centered Care in Maryland. We know, and we've heard about it this morning, that when families are welcomed as partners in care in healthcare facilities, patients have better and, should I say, safer experience and outcomes. There's also evidence to suggest that organizations benefit from fewer readmissions and that staff benefit from gaining a more personalized view of their patients. In 2015, CFHI and a coalition of Canadian partners, many of you in this room, launched Better Together in Canada, spreading the family presence policy innovation across the country. At that time, we released a study showing that out of 114 large acute care hospitals which we surveyed, fewer than 1 in 3 had accommodating visiting policies, and even fewer offered 24/7 access to designated family members. Ces politiques sur la présence des familles font partie des mesures pratiques que les organismes de services de santé peuvent adopter officiellement et mettre en œuvre pour mieux axer leurs soins sur le patient et la famille. Better Together encourages healthcare organizations to review their visiting policies with patients and families to eliminate the barrier of access to family members, viewing them not merely as visitors, but rather as partners in care and allies for quality and safety. So our work included a free 17-month e-collaborative aimed at supporting organizations across the country to implement new policies on family presence. We also encouraged healthcare organizations to take Better Together, the Better Together pledge, to publicly demonstrate their commitment to review and implement family presence policies in their own organizations. In all, 12 teams took part in the e-collaborative and 50 organizations took the pledge, a very inspiring result. Today, CFHI continues to seek out innovations and partnerships that will support us in our efforts to expand the pan-Canadian spread of family presence policies. We continue to learn and to grow. Now more than ever in all of our programs, we're involving patients and families, and in all stages, from design and planning to implementation and evaluation. And it's very clear that patient engagement is here to stay. Votre présence ici aujourd'hui est encourageante et reflète bien la réaction des gens à nos efforts. Nous vous remercions chaleureusement pour votre appui envers ces initiatives. Over the next 2 days, you'll have many opportunities to share your experiences, to talk about your successes and challenges, and discover how to put your family presence plans into action. Nous sommes heureux que vous soyez parmi nous et nous sommes impatients de tirer des apprentissages de votre expérience. almost about 9 years ago, when we at CFHI were looking at our strategy, where were we going as we looked ahead? Our focus was, what is going to transform Canadian healthcare? What needs to be done? We know we've got a much-loved, I do think some Canadians are delusional, a much-loved healthcare system that comes out as very middling in international comparisons. What did we think would make the most difference? 3 things, but the first was patient and community engagement. If patients aren't at the center, there'll be no transformation. The second thing was continuously supporting improvements within institutions in all areas. And the third was understanding what policy frameworks are going to make care best for patients. So your presence here today is pushing that transformation of Canadian healthcare forward. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Maureen, for those words and for your leadership over those 9 years in identifying those priorities that time ago. And so I'd like us to begin really with our meeting aim and thinking about the reason that we're here and what we're hoping to accomplish, and bringing everyone together on this common theme. And in the stories you've heard already, and the exercise that Mallory has asked us to do in closing our eyes, it is something that often touches close to home for all of us. And so we'd like to bring leadership, and we use the term leadership to speak about our patient advisors, as well as our formal executive leadership, middle management, government, and policymakers. And we'd like to bring people together to learn from provincial jurisdictions who have already undertaken this work. And I'm so happy that in the room we have excellent examples of whole provinces, including Saskatchewan, including New Brunswick, including PEI, who have done this work. So we'd like to learn from those who have done this well. And within your own jurisdictions, I imagine that there are places and bright spots where this is happening. So we'd like to share some of that. And then the other part is really around the practicality of implementing. So it's one thing to know what a policy is. What we've heard is that this transforms culture. So getting at the heart of what are the levers and mechanisms to implement this policy and practice, we'd like to share and learn from one another. And specifically, we're going to bring to attention some of the evidence that comes through experiential knowledge, as well as the academic literature. And we know there's evidence to support that this is not only the right thing to do, but makes good sense from a business case as well. I've mentioned already learning from one another and those in the room. We'll talk a little bit about enablers and some of the challenges that may arise, as well as strategies to mitigate those and address them when they do come up. And finally, what is so interesting and inspiring about this work is that this is something that we should be doing in partnership with patients and with families. And that doesn't mean necessarily only at the bedside wherein we're inviting people into our institutions, but how are we working with patients and families to make this change? And I'll be sharing a little bit more about our e-collaborative experience. And on those 12 teams who are with us in this case, there was an expectation that as part of the core team who is involved in this, they had patient and family advisors on that core team developing and making this change in their organization. So I hope that you'll see as one of the themes throughout is how we're partnering with patients at that organizational design level to go and effect change. And finally, the campaign, and CFHI has been involved in the campaign from about 2014-15. And in that time, we've developed a number of tools and resources. We've made translations available in French as well to the Institute for Patient and Family-Centered Care resources. And so we hope to generate a number of and show really what those resources are. We do have a couple of example policies, for example, at the back, as well as the change package we developed. And the change package is sort of a step-by-step, if you will, process in terms of how would an organization go about a change such as this. Many of the topics that we'll be talking on today are featured in the change package.
So for those of you in the room, there's two flip charts at the back. One is for you to capture on sticky notes your aha moments. And the other is to write down something that you've learned. And then we're going to recap these at the end of the day and see, whose epiphany moments are similar and where do they differ? Are there some contextual pieces or cultural differences that perhaps come forward? And then the things that we learned, so that we can ensure that this is in a learning environment and that as we move to tomorrow, we can incorporate any of those pieces that perhaps we need to expand more on into the content.
So we will be making that reminder throughout the day. Thanks, Mallory. And I did want to acknowledge that we will be doing a formal tour de table and introductions in one of our later sessions, but I didn't want to get too far into our day without recognizing who's in the room. So at this point, I would like to talk a little bit about who's in the room. And when we were planning the Better Together Policy Roundtable, we were thinking about who needed to be involved. And so we had reached out first to government representatives with the specific ask about identifying the person who is responsible for assessing the feasibility of family presence policies at a large scale, and or we also know that organizations are doing this. So who would the government person be who is doing the work around family presence? From there, we asked governments, who can you not do this work without? And certainly we recognize that there are provincial policy organizations and quality organizations who are doing this work in partnership with governments and are often instrumental. And certainly last but not least, we said we would invite you and welcome you to bring a patient and family advisor who you might consider doing this in partnership with. And so from each of these places, and I'd like to ask the patient and family advisors in the room to please stand up. So thank you for being here. And among that group, CFHI also offered a patient scholarship. And this was really to broaden the voices in the room. And so certainly we welcome those who are here as patient scholars, if you will. And thank you for providing your time and energy, as well as to all of the advisors in the room. Thank you for grounding us in the reality of what it's like to be a patient or a family member. That is why you're here today, to share your experience. So thank you for being here. I will ask that all government representatives stand up. So thank you for being here. We have great representation from across the country in 12 of our 13 provinces and territories. Thank you. And I'll ask all other partners to stand up, and in this case, this includes CFHI as a partner to the organizations who are leading this work. So thank you very much for your support in being here today. And of course, I do welcome those who are participating by live stream as well, who aren't here in the room, but we look forward to engaging you, and thank you for participating remotely. And this work that started 3 years ago isn't something that we're doing on our own. And as Maureen mentioned, this really was spearheaded by the Institute for Patient and Family-Centered Care. We signed on at the beginning of the campaign, but certainly this is a coalition of people and organizations who are supportive of this movement, and if you will, and that changing culture to recognize family members not as visitors, but as partners in care. And so as part of our efforts within Canada, we have sought out the support from a number of organizations who are not healthcare providers, but rather supporting organizations. And so we're grateful for their support as part of the campaign, some of which are in the room today. And thank you for being part of this movement. And lastly, I wanted to acknowledge some of you may have seen the Patients Included logo. If you're not familiar, this is, I think, another movement, if you will, that started a couple of years ago and was really focused on deciding and being intentional about how patients and family members are included. And we're talking about at conferences, at organized events such as today. And so this is an accredited process that we go through, and there are about 5 criteria that are listed, and it's really about being intentional about if you're inviting patients and families into the room, how might they feel welcomed, not as guests at the table, but as part of the family. And so we have on our website in more detail about how we've met all these criteria, but we're proud that we have received this designation for this particular event. And so I would like to thank those who are involved in receiving this accreditation, and I would be remiss to not thank our steering committee. And I will thank them in great detail later, but we do have a steering committee that helped us to put this together, including patients, including families, including those who are leading this work across the provinces who have already moved in this way. So thank you to all involved, and as I said, we're very proud that we have this and open to your feedback on how you feel included as a patient and family member at this event.
So for those of you in the room, there's 2 flip charts at the back. One is for you to capture on sticky notes your aha moments. And the other is to write down something that you've learned. And then we're going to recap these at the end of the day and see, whose epiphany moments are similar and where do they differ? Are there some contextual pieces or cultural differences that perhaps come forward? And then the things that we learned, so that we can ensure that this is in a learning environment and that as we move to tomorrow, we can incorporate any of those pieces that perhaps we need to expand more on into the content.
So we will be making that reminder throughout the day. Thanks, Mallory. And I did want to acknowledge that we will be doing a formal tour de table and introductions in one of our later sessions, but I didn't want to get too far into our day without recognizing who's in the room. So at this point, I would like to talk a little bit about who's in the room. And when we were planning the Better Together Policy Roundtable, we were thinking about who needed to be involved. And so we had reached out first to government representatives with the specific ask about identifying the person who is responsible for assessing the feasibility of family presence policies at a large scale, and or we also know that organizations are doing this. So who would the government person be who is doing the work around family presence? From there, we asked governments, who can you not do this work without? And certainly we recognize that there are provincial policy organizations and quality organizations who are doing this work in partnership with governments and are often instrumental. And certainly last but not least, we said we would invite you and welcome you to bring a patient and family advisor who you might consider doing this in partnership with. And so from each of these places, and I'd like to ask the patient and family advisors in the room to please stand up. So thank you for being here. And among that group, CFHI also offered a patient scholarship. And this was really to broaden the voices in the room. And so certainly we welcome those who are here as patient scholars, if you will. And thank you for providing your time and energy, as well as to all of the advisors in the room. Thank you for grounding us in the reality of what it's like to be a patient or a family member. That is why you're here today, to share your experience. So thank you for being here. I will ask that all government representatives stand up. So thank you for being here. We have great representation from across the country in 12 of our 13 provinces and territories. Thank you. And I'll ask all other partners to stand up, and in this case, this includes CFHI as a partner to the organizations who are leading this work. So thank you very much for your support in being here today. And of course, I do welcome those who are participating by live stream as well, who aren't here in the room, but we look forward to engaging you, and thank you for participating remotely. And this work that started 3 years ago isn't something that we're doing on our own. And as Maureen mentioned, this really was spearheaded by the Institute for Patient and Family-Centered Care. We signed on at the beginning of the campaign, but certainly this is a coalition of people and organizations who are supportive of this movement, and if you will, and that changing culture to recognize family members not as visitors, but as partners in care. And so as part of our efforts within Canada, we have sought out the support from a number of organizations who are not healthcare providers, but rather supporting organizations. And so we're grateful for their support as part of the campaign, some of which are in the room today. And thank you for being part of this movement. And lastly, I wanted to acknowledge some of you may have seen the Patients Included logo. If you're not familiar, this is, I think, another movement, if you will, that started a couple of years ago and was really focused on deciding and being intentional about how patients and family members are included. And we're talking about at conferences, at organized events such as today. And so this is an accredited process that we go through, and there are about 5 criteria that are listed, and it's really about being intentional about if you're inviting patients and families into the room, how might they feel welcomed, not as guests at the table, but as part of the family. And so we have on our website in more detail about how we've met all these criteria, but we're proud that we have received this designation for this particular event. And so I would like to thank those who are involved in receiving this accreditation, and I would be remiss to not thank our steering committee. And I will thank them in great detail later, but we do have a steering committee that helped us to put this together, including patients, including families, including those who are leading this work across the provinces who have already moved in this way. So thank you to all involved, and as I said, we're very proud that we have this and open to your feedback on how you feel included as a patient and family member at this event.
Alrighty, so now we need to do a little bit of a scan of the Better Together campaign and to understand a little bit about what's the evidence that really supports a move to open family presence. And to lead us through that, I invite Carol Fencott up to the front. Carol is the Director of Patient and Citizen Engagement for Improvement here with Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement.
Good morning, everyone. It is so inspiring to be in this room full of people. And when we were first starting out with the planning of this event, you know, it's always those unknowns of who's going to show up and how many and how do we provide a program that will be of interest. And so I start out first by saying thank you for all making the trek here to Ottawa. I'm glad that we were able to provide this lovely weather for all of you. And in particular, I would like to acknowledge the efforts of Christine Micah, Isabel Jonka, Mallory Keller, and the rest of the steering committee that have really put together, I think, a great 2 days for all of us, in CFHI words, the all teach, all learn, to be in the same room together, to really think about how are we advancing this work. I would also like to thank the opening words of Albert and of Darlene for really grounding us this morning. And when I think of a comment that Albert had made, I wrote it down, that when you're in pain, you really want someone that loves you to be with you. And Darlene, the team Dick because I was always there. That was beautiful. And it always reminds us that when we're our most vulnerable, that is when we want somebody to be there with us at all times and when we want to be with our loved ones. And so, again, we move forward with that grounding throughout the next 2 days. So I'm going to give you the grand tour in the next 20 minutes or so of what is the evidence for Better Together. And what is the evidence from Better Together that we're learning together as an organization that has gone through this campaign? And we're still towards the tail end of the campaign, but also just wrapping up our e-collaborative that Maureen and Christine have alluded to. And so I'm going to build upon some of the remarks that Maureen and Christine have started you with this morning. But before I get started, I would like to make these acknowledgements. It was my predecessor, Maria Judd, who unfortunately is off sick today and wishes she could be here with us. But she was the one that brought Better Together to us as a foundation in partnership with the Institute for Patient and Family-Centered Care. And the team, Jessie, Christine, Isabel, and Carolina, that really put it into action and made a lot of this work happen. And most recently, our student intern, Haley Warren, who's with us, who's been doing a lot of the work around the evaluation as we've been wrapping up the e-collaborative. And so before I start, I'm going to give you a bit of the context of CFHI, and then talk about how we ended with Better Together and what is the evidence to support, and then again, the lessons learned. Before I get started, I'd be interested to know, before you arrived here in Ottawa for this roundtable, how many of you were familiar with CFHI, with the work of the foundation? So a good chunk of you. Okay. So who are we? We are a not-for-profit national organization that really looks to identify proven innovations and being able to take those innovations and spread them and scale them across Canada. And we do this by really working shoulder to shoulder with all of you, by really pulling together what I call the coalitions of the willing, teams and organizations that want to take these proven innovations and move them into practice in their own areas, in their own regions. And so we have a number of collaboratives, and we do this through a vehicle that we call collaboratives. This all teach, all learn method of learning together, learning about the innovation, and learning about quality improvement methodologies, change management strategies, and building and evaluation frameworks around that to do this work together. And so we have a number of collaboratives on the go. You may have heard of some of them: connected medicine, antipsychotic deprescribing, and long-term care homes. And our most recent one, which is Inspired, which is really a scale-up of best practices related to community care for advanced chronic obstructive lung disease. And then, as Maureen mentioned, we've done a number of collaboratives specifically in the area of patient and family engagement to support the capacity building of organizations to do this work. And we really aim to improve the experience of care, the health of populations, and adding value for money in the work that we do. And as Maureen alluded to, we are always looking to work in partnership with patients and families to be able to embed their voices, their perspectives in all of the work that we do, and in supporting teams to embed the voices of patients and families as they're implementing. And we recognize there are many, many levers for change when we're doing this work of the collaboratives. And I pointed out, too, in particular, the engagement of patients and citizens in this work. And in particular, and what we're talking about in the next 2 days, is really about using policy as a lever for change. So creating supportive policies and incentives for this work. So the arguments for family presence. And Maureen has alluded to some of the evidence that exists, but I'm going to really start at the beginning. And then when we talk about family presence, a lot of what people immediately go to is the notion of 24/7 visitation, the fact of open visiting hours and open access. But what we like to make sure that people are thinking of families more than visitors, we also recognize that there is a place, or there is a differentiation when we're talking about family presence, in that The family presence policy really speaks to that designated partner, designated by the patient as somebody that they want to have open access, which leads us to this family presence policy, versus a visiting visiting policy, which is different for visitors that may be coming in to visit. And so again, this differentiation, when we think of family presence, it's really all about, as we know, enabling patients to designate partners in care who are welcome 24 hours a day. And the policy elements themselves are around that the family is designated or identified by the patient. And family, we use that term quite openly. It doesn't need to be a blood relative per se, but it can be anyone that the patient wants there to be there for them. And that the policies support this identification of preferences of how they're going to be involved. So it doesn't mean that the doors are wide open and anyone is walking in at any time, but it's very intentional about who is going to be partners in care for the patient as they have determined. And it's moving this policy into practice that is the important part of this, because when you are able to have a patient or a family member that is designated to be the partner in care, it opens up what we call this family presence bundle. And that really comes from our partner, Bev Johnson, who leads the Institute for Patient and Family-Centered Care, in conversations that we've had for her when we've talked about the ability of a family member to be present allows them to communicate openly through the whiteboards, to be present for hourly rounding, shift reports at the bedside, and importantly, at discharge planning. So it's a whole range of practices that are included when you have this type of policy. And so a lot of the evidence that we have, as Maureen has alluded to, and very nicely or aptly in the paper this morning related to the neonatal care in BC, what family presence does, and there are a number of quality indicators that we see the needle moving on. And so in a study that was done, it was a 3-year quality improvement study actually done in the US, 45 healthcare organizations that had implemented family presence policies, but again, with that were the practices of that family presence bundle. So having the hourly rounding, having the whiteboards in place, having family members present at discharge planning, all of those which helped to increase communication, which then led to improved coordination of care. And in the same study, and I think as Darlene had alluded to, having a family member present, that can often be that catch of errors that potentially could happen. And what they found was a decrease in medication errors and a decrease in falls by having patients and family members much more involved in the care, in understanding the practices around safe care, that they found a decrease in patient falls by 35% and a decrease in patient injury as a result of falls by 63%. There was a very recent, I think it was 2016, or a recent systematic review that pulled together 15 studies that had been done in having family members as part of the discharge planning process. And in that case, by having family members present, it actually reduced readmission rates by 25% at 90 days and by 24% at 180 days. So by having another set of eyes and ears on this and understanding the care that needs to be delivered at home actually helps, again, to improve care and reduce these readmissions. I think very importantly, and probably this is where the most evidence sits, is really around improvements in patient and family experience of care. And we know that the literature is starting to show us quite clearly how patient experience of care is linked quite clearly to effectiveness of care and safety. And those are important linkages. And so that when we see, by having family presence, by having open visitation for those designated care members, we see improved HCAP scores or patient experience scores, increases in patient satisfaction. We see the inclusion of these family presence bundles of patients and families in the bedside rounding, and an increase in emotional well-being, and a decrease then in the anxiety and in the stress and depression of family members and patients. And so all of these are very positive indicators around experience of care. And I think what has been very nice, and maybe it wasn't an unintended consequence, but it's been nice to see not only has the experience for patients and families improved, but also for that of staff, where there is a much better understanding. And a lot of this work, I will say, comes out of ICU, studies that have happened in ICU. So where patients may not be able to participate fully, but by having family members there, all of a sudden staff were talking about how they started to know the patients better. They started to understand and get a sense of who they were as people and not as patients. So a much more personalized view, the ability to develop individualized care plans then as a result, and being much more engaged in their work and being much more confident in how they were able to communicate with patients and families then in these settings. What's interesting and has often been a fear when people talk about family presence and having open visitors all the time is a concern about infection rates and the spread of infections. And clearly where the evidence is leading us in this area is showing there actually has been no change or no increase at all in infection rates. And again, a lot of this comes out of work that's been done in ICUs. And in fact, there's actually been decreases in complications of patients because of family presence while in these ICUs. And I think in the work around neonatal care, that's definitely been shown of a lot of great indicators, quality indicators as a result of having parental care with these very fragile preemies. So that gives you an overview of sort of the evidence that continues to evolve, that exists and continues to evolve for us, but where it landed us on this evidence-based policy innovation that we wanted to take up. And first, as Maureen and Christine have both alluded to, taking up first in our campaign, and then supporting that campaign through the eCollaborative. So again, acknowledging the supporting organizations that are both national and provincial in scope that are supporting this work of family presence, and to indicate the 50 organizations that have so far pledged. And what I do like to point out is that while we talk about them as organizations, some of the pledgers were entire provinces. So obviously within those provinces, there were a number of organizations that would be looking to embed this work in those regions. And some of the pledgers had already moved into this area of family presence already, notably Saskatchewan that certainly has led the way in this area. And so a number of those pledgers, again, had already moved to implement this work, and others, again, were pledging quite publicly to say, we are going to do this work within the next year. So what I want to point out is, and as Christine has shown us already, the campaign is really what started us in this area. And what we wanted to do was be very intentional about how we were supporting those organizations that were making the pledge to then be able to make the changes. And so we did that through the eCollaborative, which I'm going to get into. But we had also done a number of other things, as Christine had mentioned, the change package and toolkit that all of you can take a look at as a resource for people that wanted to make this change, on-call webinars and providing case studies for people to really understand how have others done this work. But I'm really going to focus more on the eCollab and the work that collaborative did. So this was an 11-month collaborative that was virtual in nature. So it was one of the first that we had done in this way, because many of our collaboratives, we bring teams together face-to-face as well. But this was a free collaborative that we were offering. And it had a number of elements embedded within it, again, to support the teams as they were first assessing and reviewing their current state. What are the policies? What do the policies look like now within organizations? To then move it into how do we then develop a new policy that supports family presence, and what does that look like? And then in phase 3, how do we begin the implementation of this policy? And in every phase of this, there was the partnership of patients and family members that was very key to it, to enable this work to move forward and to be able to support organizations that were doing this work again together with patients and families. I should mention that we were in touch with them many, many times, offering a number of webinars throughout this, affinity calls, and I think importantly, having expert faculty, coaches, and staff that were mentoring throughout this. And I would like to acknowledge we actually have 3 of the Better Together coaches in the room with us, I would like to point them out to you, Patty O'Connor, Eleanor Revoir, and Angela Morin, who is a patient advisor. And so they were part of this work as we move through this collaborative. So of the 50 pledging organizations through the campaign, we actually had 12 that signed on with us from across Canada. And I'm going to just jump right into the evaluation and give you an overall sense, not a lot of the nitty-gritty details, but a sense of the kinds of things that we would be looking for in the evaluation. So the first being that of wanting to build capacity of the organizations that had joined the e-collaborative and how they were partnering with patients and families. We are always looking to build capacity of the organizations that work with us in the area of quality improvement and change management, and then actually look at what did they succeed in doing? Did they actually get to that place of developing the policy, but then implementing it through this time of the collaborative, and what did that look like? And then throughout the evaluation, it's a number of methods that we use. There are surveys that we do to give us a baseline, and then throughout the different phases, as well as different scales, and then qualitatively captured through the reporting of each of the teams. And so when we look at the ability of organizations to partner with patients and families as they were doing this work, as Christine had mentioned, for each of the teams to be part of this collaborative, our ask was that they have patients and families embedded within their steering committees or their projects teams to help guide the work in some way. And so what came out of this is a number of strategies that we saw the teams use, notably having patient and family advisors actually be a part of their working groups and teams, but where they used a lot of other consultative forms of engagement, reaching out through focus groups, through surveys, to really try to understand what were patient and family experiences like now in their current state, to understand the kind of changes that they needed to make. And then importantly, as they were then developing the policy and then moving to implementation, how they were able to seek the advice and guidance of patients and families throughout that work of looking at wording, helping to actually deliver educational modules, helping to design and develop resources that the teams were then going to use to educate staff on these new policies that were being put into place. What they found was that by embedding the patients and families throughout this collaborative, then helped them really be able to advocate for this need for family presence, but also this need for other ways that they could be engaging with patients and families and other initiatives that they were doing. Interestingly, there was one team in particular that pointed out that the work that they did through this collaborative was actually launching them into further research, particularly into some of the quality indicators around family presence. And then really being able to use and leverage the experiences of patients and families as a source of change and understanding to again embed this work. And I think a message that you're going to hear from many in the room as we move forward in the next 2 days, the implementation of this policy is not a one-time deal. that it is a constant change. It is a journey that you need to keep going back to again and again. And the way that it looks like in one unit or in one area is going to need to look different in other areas. And so those adaptations, the adjustments that need to be made, but all of that is important, and that you get a much stronger understanding by embedding the voices and perspectives of patients and families. In terms of the quality improvements, and for anyone that's involved in quality improvement work, we look a lot at knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And I was very happy to see when Haley produced some of the initial results from the evaluation of those charts that you like to see, of those increases from baseline through the different phases to the ends, of increases in knowledge, of the team members feeling much more confident in their skills and in their knowledge in being able to assess, to plan, to implement, and to evaluate a quality improvement initiative. And so we saw those nice changes. We were also able to see every single one of these collaborative teams move through and make advancements. And for that, we use the collaborative assessment scale. And this is what it looks like. It's basically a self-assessment that teams can use of where are they in this quality improvement journey. And quite nicely, when we had the teams first start at baseline, they were at those very initial planning stages, and as they moved through, they were all marching through and making progress through these. And again, when you think of those newly formed teams, and particularly teams that were including patients and families, it was nice to see that trajectory. Many of them, the average score when we finished this collaborative, which was rather short relative to some of our other collaboratives, but they were at a 3. And I think that would be totally expected, because in the time frame, many of these teams were just at that implementation or had just moved into the implementation. And so we wouldn't expect vast, significant improvements at that time, and that they were working towards sustainability. And importantly, all of the teams, so of the 12 teams that were part of the collaborative, one team had dropped out or had never basically attended any of the webinars or were involved in any significant way and didn't sort of follow our reporting processes. Interestingly, this team, we were able to see via Twitter that they have fully implemented family presence, and they were doing it in their own way, and they may have been accessing our resources, but that they had moved along but just hadn't fully joined on to the eCollab as we had designed it. Of the 11 remaining teams, 9 actually completed these final reports, which is where we're getting a lot of our information from. So it is a small N, granted, but we know of the 9 that had reported to us, 8 had developed the new policy and were moving full into implementation. 4 of those had already implemented. 2 were on the cusp, and 2 were still getting their policy through. And that what was interesting, because there was a range of where people were implementing the policies. So we have the examples of the full-scale provinces like PEI, like New Brunswick, that were moving it well across their regions, to other organizations that were just starting in a few pilot units to begin, with the hopes of then spreading and scaling across their organizations, and then some that were going full on across their institutions. But what was interesting through this policy development was seeing the nuances of the different kinds of policies or different components of the policies that were embedded because of the different patient populations, because of the different needs of the patients and family members within that. And I'm going to come full circle from the evidence because, this is an area, of course, that is of great interest for us as an improvement organization, but how does any of our work link to those domains of quality improvement, of efficiency, effectiveness, safety, coordination of care, appropriateness, and patient experience? So at the start of the collaborative, as we are putting evaluation frameworks in place, we offer guidance for each of the teams about the kinds of measures that they're going to want to embed. I'm going to pick out 3 in particular that I would say the teams were moving towards. And again, because of the nature of the collaborative, where at the time the collaborative finished and we got the final report, some of them were just moving into implementation. We actually don't have a lot of this data, or it wasn't shared with us from the teams at the time. I will say, though, optimistically, we do have a 6-month follow-up call with these collaborative teams that I believe is happening next week, and we will be following up on some of the indicators. So the 3 that I really want to focus on are safety, coordination of care, and patient experience, because those are the ones where, 1, the evidence is very clear and where we do have some evaluation measures that we could put in place. So around safety, there are teams that are looking to track from baseline to post-implementation of the policy. Medication errors and falls are the 2 most prevalent that people talk about, and those are indicators that all organizations follow. So those are easy ones that any one of us would be able to, because we have data capture for that. Coordination of care was really coming through some of those family presence bundle practices. So the use of the whiteboards, the shift report at the bedside, the family presence at discharge planning rounds, those kinds of things that people were monitoring through coordination of care. And then, of course, patient experience. I would say all of the organizations that have been working with us, and I think there are standards that are coming out where we are starting to measure patient experience, and that where they're trying to capture that and taking a look baseline to post-implementation, but also because many organizations were only implementing in certain units, they were able to have a comparable group of where family presence was not happening and where family presence was happening. And so we have been using this as a minimum number set, right, in terms of the reach that we have had through this collaborative. And this is based on the reporting of 6 of the teams that had reported in the final report, knowing at what points they were at in their implementation. So these would have been all organizations that had gone into full implementation, and within, whether it be units, organizations, or regions, of our very, very conservative estimate of the number of patients that would be influenced and impacted by having family presence policies implemented within their organizations or regions. And I think, as Albert, as Darlene had grounded us in such a lovely way this morning, we are always here thinking about patients and families and the experience that people have. And when people feel more comfortable, when their stress levels, their anxiety levels go down, when their emotional well-being is being cared for by having the presence of a loved one, this is why we are all here. And I leave you with that, and I hope that there are many opportunities that we are able to share those kinds of experiences throughout the next 2 days. And again, I would very much welcome your questions and your comments on any of the work that we've been doing and on any of the evidence that exists. So thank you.
And just a reminder, this is being live streamed. Thank you all for being here, and hello to those on the live stream. And back in the slides. I'm delighted to be here with our partners and colleagues at Kingston Health Sciences Center, formerly Kingston General Hospital. And they have been leading this work for a long time. And I am joined by 3 people. 2 are in the room, and I have Cynthia on the phone with us. And we really wanted to illustrate sort of from different levels, if you will. And you've heard from Eleanor, who is the Chief Nursing Executive, and Angela is and still is a patient experience advisor at Kingston. And on the phone with us, we have Cynthia Phillips, who's the operational director right now of the medicine program at Kingston Health Sciences Center, and at the time was really involved in their interprofessional practice area of work. So without further ado, I will pass things over to Angela, to Eleanor, and Cynthia is also with us on the phone.
Hi, everybody. Hi to everybody that's watching on live stream. Hopefully there's some of you out there watching on live stream. So we've had a really great morning of discussion, and I think the value in a day like this and bringing everyone together is to hear from everybody. So we're really going to hopefully provide that opportunity and that conversation. But I want to start off by sort of going back to something that Mallory did this morning and building on that a little bit. So I'm a real believer in the adage that people may forget what you said and they may forget what you did, but they will always remember how you made them feel. So with that in mind, I would like to ask you to once again close your eyes. And I would like you to remove your healthcare policymaker hat, or your administrator, or your provider, or your nurse, or your staff, or even your patient advisor hat, just for a few minutes. And I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think about that person this morning that you thought of when Mallory asked you to keep someone in mind. And I want you to think about someone you love. Maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's a child, maybe it's a partner or a family member or a friend, and you're holding hands. And they're sick, and they're injured, and they're scared, and they're vulnerable, and they're lying in a hospital bed in your organization, in your province, in your region. They hold your hand really tight, and they say, "Please do not leave me here alone. Please do not go." Now, I want you to think about that person. And how do you respond? Do you say, "I have to go, visiting hours are over," and leave them there alone? Do you say you will stay, knowing that you are breaking the rules, that you're going to have to ask for a favor, you're going to ask someone to look the other way, negotiate with someone to make an exception to the visiting hour rules? Or do you say, because you know you are welcome to stay, "I will be here as long as you need me to be"? Think about those options. Feel those options. Remember that feeling. And then open your eyes. Getting rid of restrictive visiting hours, having a patient and family-centered family presence policy is about being compassionate and respectful of patients' wishes and relationships, and allowing loved ones to be there as long as they are needed and involved in care as they are needed. It is also about patient safety and quality of care. Before we start talking, though, about the challenges of implementing a family presence policy, I'd like to share a couple of personal experiences with you. And we've heard this morning some really powerful personal experiences. These all happened at different hospitals across Ontario over a number of years. The night after my mom had major cancer surgery, we left because the announcement said we had to leave when visiting hours were over, and returned the next morning to find her really distraught. It had been a bad night for her, and I decided to break the rules and stay with her all the next night. I got her water, which was out of reach. I comforted her in dark moments. I stopped her from pulling out tubes and IVs, and I talked her out of getting out of bed in the middle of the night and trying to make a run for it. I was there to hear the doctor's instructions and to ask questions that we needed answered before taking her home. I was there to be part of her care team, and I held her hand. Having a family presence policy in place means patients can partner with staff in determining who or if they want someone to stay with them, and relieves staff of the challenge of breaking the rules and circumventing policy just to do what they know is the right thing to do. It determines who the patient would like with them, who can partner in their care, who can help keep them safe. A couple of years ago, my dad had a life-threatening cardiac procedure. In preparation for the day, my mom pulls up the website of the hospital and sees that there are restrictive visiting hours. From that point on, we become stressed about the inevitable confrontation we now expect if we are forced to leave. My parents have been married over 50 years. They are best friends. How could anyone think that forcing my mom to leave my dad's side, to let go of his hand if he needed her, was the right thing to do? Knowing an organization has a family presence policy that allows families, as defined by the patient, to partner in the care of their loved one is a huge comfort, provides peace of mind, and reduces anxiety and stress for everyone involved. Last year, my husband had hip revision surgery. I was able to visit him in the recovery room and was included in the conversations with all the healthcare providers. I was welcome to stay as long as I wanted. I helped him to the washroom, went to his physio, walked with him in the halls, repositioned his pillows, and held his hand. I was made to feel like a welcome partner in his care. As we have what I hope will be a really candid discussion about the perceived challenges surrounding the implementation of family presence, I would really like you to remember how you felt when you had to decide what you would do. Because for me, and most of the patients I know and families that I know, restrictive visiting hours are considered an archaic, system-centered practice, and they have absolutely no place in a patient and family-centered care healthcare system. So, I'm going to turn things over now to Eleanor to start the discussion.
Great, thank you, Angela. And you're not going far, right? Because we do really want this to be very interactive. But I'd just like to sort of make the point that when you listen to the experience that Angela described, when you listen to the experience this morning that Albert described and that Darlene described, or the accounts in the open sharing session, we really have to go back to Mark's point this morning, is why would family presence not be ever present in all of our organizations? It's a slam dunk, or you can call it a no-brainer. But I think if we look at it in the positive, it becomes a game changer in healthcare. It's one of those innovations that truly can change the course. So if we sort of ask ourselves, why isn't it that way? We'll often hear of what get thrown up as the barriers, which are typically thought to be immovable obstacles for us. But in reality, those who have implemented the policy change will know that they're not barriers. They were perceived barriers, but if they're well planned for, it actually becomes effortless in terms of enabling that presence of family to support patient family-centered care. The one thing I would say is absolutely a requirement, and I think it's the opportunity of all within this room, is that at a strategy level, be it at a unit strategy, a program, an organizational strategy level, a ministry level, provincial, national, at a strategy level, there has to be the commitment that patient family-centered care is a priority. Family presence is a means to that end. And then it becomes not if you do it, it becomes how you do it. You just sort of then begin to say, what are people concerned about? And then how do you begin to unbundle that, break it down, and begin to go through the process of change. It isn't actually simply about having a policy. A policy is a piece of paper that people will either attend to if they're part of the development of it and understand the value and the consequence of following it, or it can become something that's ignored. So the process of developing the policy will be key, and the process of implementing it and ensuring it's sustained is key. So when we went through this process, we launched our first policy in 2009. Cynthia Phillips, who's on the phone, was a huge part of that, the leadership of that change. And we basically knew going into it where the resistors were and what were being identified as the presumed failures of making such a horrendous change in healthcare within our organization. So we had to prepare for those. What we thought is we would like to hear first from you. We've got them all laid out. We can tell you how we approach them, but we really would like to hear from you what you have either heard or you presume to be the challenges and the myths that you need to blow through, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we approach that and share some of the other ones that maybe don't get touched on. So we would really like to hear from you first and foremost. Some of them came out this morning, and Cynthia is going to be able to really partner in this. We don't want to delay. Yep, right back. And yeah, you can either speak really loudly as Christine gets to you. There's just going to be one question, Cynthia, from somebody at the back, and then we'll have you in, okay?
Comme je vous ai dit tout à l'heure, on a implanté la politique. Do you hear? Okay. It's better? Okay. On a implanté la politique au mois de septembre, puis il y a des familles dans la communauté qui se donnaient le droit de venir manger la nourriture des patients ou ils arrivaient après une soirée bien arrosée vers 2 heures du matin, puis avec leur sac de couchage, des jeunes ados où ils venaient coucher à l'hôpital. Ça a été difficile pour les employés de bien gérer ces situations-là, en fin de compte. Alors, j'aimerais savoir comment vous, si ça vous a déjà arrivé, puis comment vous avez géré les situations, en fin de compte.
So in translating, Vitalité had implemented as of September of this year their family presence policies, and some of the challenges that have arisen since that time, for example, are people are coming in, partners in care, but also the expectation and are eating food of the hospital that doesn't belong to them. The other pieces around managing people in this instance, again, they can be family members who are coming in after sort of a night out and are arriving at the hospital, possibly intoxicated, bringing their sleeping bags, staying over. It's a sleepover and a party for everyone. So just two particular things that have arisen since that we'd appreciate your perspective on.
Okay. Cynthia, do you want to just give a little bit of preamble and respond to that?
Just wanted to say for us, it was 2009, and we were redesigning our model of care to be interprofessional and patient and family centered. So building on our commitment to create and foster a patient and family centered environment, we introduced flexible visiting the same day as our new model of care debuted. What we recognized was that family, friends, and other support members contribute to positive health outcomes and a positive patient experience. And in your particular example, that is not acceptable. We can limit the number of visitors. It's not a party. We have to respect the care needs not only of that patient, but the other patients around them. And recently, in fact, I had a family member that I had to ask to leave because it was inappropriate. The family member had been drinking, and that's not acceptable.
And I would add into that, I think Cynthia's making the point that family presence is to a purpose. It's not just to say, okay, let's open the doors and let the public swarm in and use the hospital setting for whatever their intended purpose might be. It is with that notion that it is those that the patient is identifying are going to be helpful to them, and it is in regard to their care and their well-being. And as Cynthia identified, it doesn't take away the obligation of an organization looking at how do they manage what goes on within a care environment. It has to be done with the mindset of each individual patient, like every patient is the only patient. There are many patients, and all of their needs need to be respected. So if the presence of individuals is beginning to interfere with that or affect that in any negative way, then we need to know that staff feel confident identifying that they have the processes clearly identified to them and in terms of how they respond, that they're supported with education, that they know how to intervene in what could become a more contentious interaction. So a piece of it, when we were looking at all of the changes, you had to really be mindful of what some of the education is that's required so staff feel supported in what you're asking them to deal with. And that the processes are in place so that there can be a brisk response if someone is finding themselves with a challenge that they're feeling is getting out of their control, and that there will be a full team response, and that there'll be opportunity to review it and see how could this have been handled differently going forward. So there really needs to be that identification of what's thought to be a risk, and when we were implementing the change, we definitely heard that people were really, really concerned that it was just going to be massive crowds around the clock, that it was going to become a huge security issue. And so we had to sort of hear those concerns, work them through with the staff and with patients and families as we planned the implementation, and then have the processes in place. And we tested many of them as well to be sure that staff knew that if all of a sudden they needed a security presence, that they knew how long it would take for that security response and how they would be supported, but they also knew what they had to do. So I think that that thinking, identifying risks, looking at what the education and supports and skill sets are that are required for them, ensuring that staff are comfortable with them, and then recognizing it is management to a patient's care needs. It is not simply creating an alternate social setting for family reunions.
The other piece that I would add to that is that I think there is an assumption that healthcare providers and people that work in healthcare actually want to talk to families, and that they want to engage with families, and we can't assume that that's the case. There has to be education around this. People have to learn how to communicate with patients and families. And I would also say that we need to be sharing that education with our patients and families. So if we don't articulate what family presence means and it's not clear to the patient or family member, you absolutely can run into those situations. And I think that one of the points that I would make too is that we've been doing this at KGH for a while, and like just recently, I was at a meeting and somebody said, well, you know, there's patient or there's family members, they've been in after hours, that's a security risk. And we said, okay, so why is that happening? Because that's not the security policy. So we need to revisit what's going on with security. And I think sometimes family presence is getting blamed for failures of other policies in our healthcare system, and that it's easier to blame family presence and families being in the hospital than to go back and revisit some of your policies around communication, around how people engage with patients and families. And again, that goes to to family presence being a lever for patient engagement and patient and family-centered care.
Another issue that might be identified as a potential obstacle, or?
I'm very curious to know how you handle the complicated family dynamics where the individual themselves may identify there being one key person that they want as their partner in care, but there may be other family members who feel very strongly that they should be involved, and the patient may not always be able to say, no, I don't want you involved in my care, but it actually is harmful to them. How do you tease that out and not create a rift within the family between patient and people they don't want as part of their ongoing everyday care?
Okay. Cynthia, do you want to comment on that? Or start?
We identify when a patient is admitted for a key contact person, and we tend to go with that person, and that person may invite someone else in, but if there's conflict, we would have a family meeting and discuss that, because we can't have a lot of people around the bedside. I mean, we allow 2 visitors at not more than 2 family members at a time. And again, that's for privacy of the other patients and for safety and security.
Again, I think it was in part looking at what the issue was and then beginning to unbundle it and say what might be the factors that are setting this up. And so it actually led to some improvements in our processes. So with the admission process, it would be identified and documented who did the patient identify as the family members, and family was totally as defined by the patient. It wasn't sort of the, and I think everybody knows this, is not necessarily marriage line, bloodline, whatever. It is who is going to be the key support for the patient or supports. And that was documented. And another part of it was also looking at if you were trying to manage some of the volume of people that might be wanting to be involved, to identify who's going to be the spokesperson for the family. And actually a lot of this led to much better communication amongst families as opposed to everybody sort of coming in at a different point, getting a different story, then reporting out, creating sort of different, like it's like the telephone game where it all gets distorted as you move along. So it becomes a very consistent, clear message. And again, if there is conflict amongst the family, then it's to recognize that for what it is and look at what are the steps that the team can take to say, this is what's happening, how can we work through this so that we are working together to the good of the care of the patient. And as Cynthia said, that would often be a team meeting or using, and sometimes it is also using different technologies to have people connected. Skype became a means, FaceTime became a means for family members to connect so they weren't necessarily feeling left out or marginalized or minimized in their contribution as a family member.
And I would also say that there needs to be some thought given to space design. When you have, and I was thinking about this earlier when I was thinking about the cultural sensitivity and recognizing that there are different cultures where a lot of family members want to be there, and that is really important to them. And so I think finding space for that is really something that we need to be thinking about. And I know, like at our hospital, there are those spaces so that families can all be together and can congregate. But if they're sharing a room with like 2 other people or something, you need to be able to find that space for those families, I think. And so I would consider how you're accommodating for that.
I think the other thing I would add is I think we went in with the mindset that we want to rely on the ultimate reasonableness of people. That if they're family members, we're actually working to the same end, that we want the best care and best outcome for the patient. And I think if you appeal to that reasonableness, typically people will respond in reasonable fashion. And as the trust increases, like again, people will come in with their experiences of having been excluded or their experiences of having been marginalized. So you actually have that to get over as you build the trust. But as that trust and transparency and communication grows in strength, then it seems to fall into place. And as I say, people are ultimately reasonable for the most part. It's not always the case. Yeah. Cynthia, yeah, we were just saying about the NICU part, because we talked this morning about how pediatrics is often a leader. Our experience, it wasn't that they weren't leading, but they threw up different concerns that had to be worked through. So do you want to speak on that?
As far as the NICU goes, they were a tough crowd to bring on board. They, in the past, had liberal visiting for parents, but very restricted visiting for other family members, such as grandparents and siblings. They were only allowed in on Sunday, and that was because of infection control. that Sundays were okay, but the other days were not.
It's true. And it raised the point, a lot of times when we would sort of hear some of what were being identified as reasons not to do this, our question typically was, well, what happens between 2 and 4? Or what happens between 6 and 8 when we've always had the doors open with like unfettered access? And that's when you were able to sort of say, okay, let's really get to the crux of the issue. And there were real issues. The nursing staff, I would say in particular, had a lot of concern about how this was going to impact them in terms of the numbers, their workload, their security at different times of day. And so those had to be heard and respected, and then working them through with the staff and with patients was what helped us really accelerate the design and the pace of the change.
So one of the compromises we made with respect to the NICU was that the parent was able to come in with another family member, and that we did limit the visits to 30 or 60 minutes, which was reasonable in our very small neonatal intensive care. But they soon came on board, and they wanted to be patient and family-centered like the rest of the organization. And in fact, they're currently front and center leading the way. We have parents now participating on rounds and participating in the care, so they've gone full spectrum to the other end, and now they're very flexible with visiting and care needs of the family.
One of the things that I've heard other patients say, and I think we heard a bit of it in the room this morning, what happens when you're a patient in a shared room and the other person has their family there all the time and they're noisy, and you're the other patient and you don't know what to do to speak up and deal with that situation, and it's bothering you? Because I know as a patient, you don't want to, well, at least for me, I don't want to upset the apple cart, so to speak. So I guess what kind of tools would empower the patient in that situation where they're feeling really uncomfortable with somebody else's family and they obviously can't move the room?
Right. So I think there's two parts to that. You're identifying what can we do to help the patient in that instance, and I think a very important part is what is the information that is given to patients and the public in general as there is a pronouncement that an organization or an area is going to move with family presence. And some of that is tools to say, this is what's being done, this is why it's being done, this is what you can expect, this is what is reasonable, and this is the course of action that you have available to you if something is unfolding that is affecting your experience in a negative fashion. Equally important is ensuring that the staff and the leaders of the organization are reaching out to the patients. So I think it can be very easy to say we've given information to the patients and they know that they can ask or they know they can call public relations if they have a problem, and leaving it there. I think a very big piece of patient-centered leadership is actually leaders taking the step of being visible, talking to patients, gaining an understanding of, is this working? And so that's part of the rounding piece, and making sure that the questions are being asked in a way that doesn't make the patient feel like they're sort of complaining about another person. They're talking about their experience, and so we need to hear what the experience is and not have them have to label it as a problem, and use our own observation and assessment skills. If you see semi-private room, and one part of that room is overloaded with patients, and there is a lot of noise going on, and there's another patient that you know what the circumstance is for that patient. That's where the team, again, needs to recognize they have a leadership and care obligation to both, and it's how do they manage that. That's the education of staff, tooling them with the right skills, creating the expectation and accountability, and then monitoring and making sure that there's that oversight of it. Cynthia, would you add anything?
No, I think you covered everything, Eleanor. I did want to say that family members can discuss it with any member of the care team, but as you said, patient relations program or the administrative coordinator. But what I have found in our experience is people are very reasonable. They don't want to interfere in the care. They just want to make sure that their family member is okay and that they're there if they need to be. They're not there to cause disruptions, and that is not the norm.
I'm really glad you brought that up, though, because there is a lot of focus sort of on how is this challenging for organizations, and not as much focus on how is it challenging for the patients and the family members. And so I just keep going back to, what is your messaging? What is your culture? You know, are you welcoming my opinion as a patient or family member? Are you truly partnering with me? And I really do think that visiting hours, restricted visiting hours, actually set up an adversarial situation right from the get-go. And so families go in with sort of a defensive, like, you're not telling me to leave. Like, I can guarantee you that there are people who would have probably left very just left if you just had a conversation that said that your loved one needs rest, and it would be very helpful if you went home and had some rest, but had a conversation as opposed to, this is our policy, get out. And so I think that we can mitigate a lot of that if we are having those conversations on an ongoing basis, and it is the culture of your organization. But the comfort of people who are trying to heal has to be a priority, and that teaching your staff how to communicate with those family members is absolutely critical to success.
I think one thing that came up this morning was in relation to some of the safety quality aspects. So I think Angela is touching on one of the measures that we had. I think a very important part of knowing whether or how you are having an impact is to look at what some of the process measures are, or what some of the outcome measures are for quality, safety, sound experience with patients. And it had been thought that we were going to have way more challenge with the volumes of people, disruptive families, and so one of the measures that we identified that we wanted to sort of track was code whites. And part of it was, and a code white is a violent behavior. It can be a violent behavior of the patient. It can be a violent behavior of a family member or a visitor. Visitor in the traditional wording. And what we found is that it went down. It didn't go up with family presence. And part of it, if you just intuitively, like you can't draw a cause and effect necessarily on that, or we weren't able to. But intuitively, if you've got family presence that really understand what are the triggers for behaviors with patients, those are identified, they can be ameliorated at an earlier point. If families have the confidence and trust of how their family members are being cared for, their anxiety goes down. So a lot of the setup to behaviors that might lead to a code white actually were being addressed merely by the change and ensuring that families were present. It may be an overstretch of cause effect, but we can look at when change happened, and we can look at how some of those indicators were affected. The other one that was raised this morning, I just want to make sure we capture it, was around infections. That I think was one of the number one risks that was identified in advance, that we were going, because we had all of these people coming in to the hospital, we were going to see a negative impact on nosocomial infections. And that, again, it was the experience proved differently than that. And part of it was hearing what the issue was identified as, getting an understanding of what the staff in the organization felt were going to be the contributing factors to that, addressing them through education, clearly engaging families in terms of how they hand wash. They were also partners in being able to say, somebody's come into the room or somebody has started to have a contact interaction with the patient, but they haven't washed their hands, and to call a halt to that. All done in a respectful way because they were supported with education. The whole isolation precautions and the steps that families would need to go to, they had to have the same understanding as the staff if they were going to support it as partners. And what ended up happening was a decrease in nosocomial infections, and there was a increase in the hand hygiene rates. But a lot of that was enabled through the partnering with patients, the advisors, and the engagement of the council in terms of identifying how can we make this better? How can we give you greater confidence that we are safeguarding you and your family members when you're in hospital? So if you look at what are important safety metrics, they're going to be tied to your strategy of quality patient experience. And if you've got those measures and look at how some of it times with introduction of family presence, it can become a very powerful tool to continue to engage those who might be skeptical.
Just on the point of infection control, I would just like to add that in preparation for our policy revision, we did a systematic review of the literature, and what we found was that changes in visiting policies in most Ontario hospitals were made following the reaction to severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS as we called it, outbreak in 2003. And the results of the review we did indicated that the rules that governed practice were based more on institutional precedent and staff assumptions with little or no evidence to support them. And our review demonstrated that there was no connection found between liberal visiting hours and increased infection rates.
We've got a question back here, and then we also have one through our live stream as well.
Okay. I'm wondering if you saw a difference among or between the different healthcare professionals as you changed policy. So did physicians respond any differently than your nursing contingent and so on throughout, I guess, the staffing, the hierarchy or so in terms of tactics, anything we can learn from your experience there?
I would say that yes, at the outset there was. I think part of it is the setup within organizations. The staff are employees of the organization, so I think when you have that employee relationship, you have, again, different levers to support requirement to attend education events. You have a different lever in terms of holding accountable to what policies are. That said, we work just as closely with the credentialed staff, so that would include the physicians, extended role nurses, midwives, dentists in our organization. So they were made aware of the policy change as it was occurring. I think the group most affected were the nursing staff, so that's where definitely there was a hearing. And what we tried to do is get the physicians or credentialed staff who were very much on board and understanding of the objective to become spokespeople for the value of it and become basically professional leaders within their group and speak at program councils, speak at the medical advisory committee, speak at the joint quality committee to about the value proposition. It did ultimately lead to credentialed staff are required to support the policies of the organization, and therefore it did at a point really become very directly tagged in. But it took different communication, it took different education approaches, and I think the takeaway I would offer in that is when you are leading any change, your approaches sometimes need to be modified depending on who the audience is. And you need to be respectful of their the limitations that they might have with timing or educational approach. So we, I think, as change unfolded, learn to adapt that, become a little bit more flexible with that, and to engage them in the design of the change that we were asking them to make within their professional group. So, Cynthia, you were really a key architect in that. Is there anything that you would add in?
I think you've summed it up, Eleanor. There was a lot of anxiety on the part of the nurses, and I think it was of the unexpected and what they assumed would happen. It settled down very quickly when they realized nothing was happening. It was like lunch bag letdown. Nothing happened.
Yeah. It was a good letdown.
I do recall one of the physicians, one of the surgeons saying, well, if the families want to talk to me, I do rounds at 6:30. And we said, that's fine. And if the family wants to be here for when you are on rounds, then so be it. And I never really heard more about it, but the anxiety that built up leading to our go live was high, but we went to staff meetings, practice councils, professional practice councils. We went all over. We had an ad in our local newspaper. We had the radio helping us. So people were aware, and they were aware that we're doing this for our patients. So, and I think we all feel the same. We want the best care for our patients.
One thing that I would say is that I think it would be really great if there was more around this in the education of all of the healthcare professions. But there are some healthcare providers that have engaged with families very well for a long time, that have a huge wealth of knowledge that we could be tapping into. And I think that, sometimes I'll hear, it's been interesting, actually, the whole process, because often with patient advisors, people will tell us things they won't tell other people that are working in the organization. Like, we very often get pulled aside and it's like, this is what's really going on. And so I've had nurses who have had the experience of partnering with patients. They're really engaged and feel very strongly about the value of it because they're living it on the front line with those patients and families every day. And then they'll have someone, a resident maybe, a physician come in who refuses to go into the room and talk to the patient, wants to have the conversation outside of the room, that sort of thing, isn't engaging. And so that's where the leadership of organizations and the alignment to policy and strategy is absolutely critical, that there is an understanding that it's not really negotiable, that for you to be practicing in this organization, you should be engaging with patients and families. And I think that the leadership of people to not back down is really important. And I think finding those champions, and those champions, I'm telling you, the porters in hospitals, the housekeeping staff, the nurses, the people who are there all the time dealing with the day in and the day out are such a huge resource and are such huge champions for patients and families. And I really think we could learn a lot from listening to some of them.
Kim, was there a question online? Okay, so the same. As a PEDS parent with a 16-year-old in and out of hospital, if extended families were allowed in more often, with infection control training, etc., then parents can go home with knowledgeable support of extended families. Presently, this is often unknown by family members because it's disjointed. So just a statement about your extended partners in care in that instance. So thanks very much for that. There was one question here, and then I see you, Julie.
Thank you. At the advisory council, when we were looking at the issue of family presence, the issue of patients who do not have immediate family, either at all or present in their local community, was raised. And I guess I'd like to know, I have two questions, one of them relating to this. As you see family presence rolling out throughout the country and becoming standardized and the norm, how do you think that there will be a burden that now is held by health professionals transferred to families, and will there be a gap in service that occurs for those people who do not have access to families and that presence in their healthcare experience?
I want to make sure that I answer. My initial response is that I think within organizations now where there are patients who don't have any or a robust presence of family, that typically there are some programs, usually through volunteer or other organizations, to support somebody coming in and having some companion time. I think there is, I'm becoming more aware of a growing movement around what they will call compassionate communities, to say how do you, because supporting them in hospital is one thing, it becomes a whole different game supporting them in the community where their isolation might be even greater. And so I think the realization that there are individuals who do not have what we, I think, now are describing as a very critical support and contributor to quality, safety, and experience. Some people just don't have any of that. And so organizations have sort of, I think, stopgap measures, good stopgap measures during hospitalization, but I think there's a greater movement now working at community levels, and I've heard it described as compassionate communities, but I'm sure there are others.
Good. And can I have one more?
Okay. Yeah. The offloading on staff. That was one point that we want to make as a caution, and it came up this morning. Is patients, the family members, however they're described, visitors, family presence, they are not there as workload relief for staff. That is not the intention, and that it becomes so, I know there have been instances where I've heard, well, we can use the families to do this. Like we can use the families for feeding, for bathing, for ambulation. It's not to say that families won't willingly be part of that sort of care plan, but if it is done with that as the primary purpose, as opposed to partnering to say, how is it I can contribute? And I agree that that's how I'm contributing. It's not that I am accepting a burden that I feel is a burden or I'm not comfortable with. We heard many people describe this morning how they felt that privilege of being able to support care. That's wonderful. That isn't always the case, and we cannot assume it. And so partnership means come to the table. Nobody knows what the plan is going to be until the discussion has happened with everybody who is developing the plan. So I think it's a very good point.
And could I just, one more question. I'm interested, we've talked a lot about visitation hours and family presence, but we haven't discussed information transfer. And I'm wondering, how do you manage access to diagnostic information in your hospital system? So if I'm a patient advocate, if I'm a designated family presence, how do I access the information about my loved one so that I can help communicate that information to the patient?
I would be somewhat dated in how I would answer that question for Kingston Health Sciences Centre, so I'll leave that to Cynthia. I think it's fair to say there are so many different information systems and so many different methodologies by which patients can gain information that, you know, one of the appeals is let's get it so that it's much easier for patients to gain access to that information. But Cynthia, do you want to describe what it is now?
We definitely, as I mentioned earlier, we ask for one contact person that we can relay information to, and then that person can relay the information to the other family members. But what I find is with unrestricted visiting, the families tend to have more information because they're around at shift change, when the physicians come around, so they are more aware of the care plan ongoing. So, and we have a process within the hospital if they do want to review the chart or anything. I mean, we have a process. You have to put in a request, and we do that, and we sit with them and explain. But I really believe that they're more aware ongoing throughout the patient's stay at the hospital.
And recognizing the time, the last message I would like to give is that it wasn't all perfect at the beginning. There was a lot of preparatory work, and the launch was much easier than I think everybody anticipated. I think there was much more anticipatory grief than there ever was challenge after the fact. But there were lessons learned. And I think it's very important to always make that commitment that feedback is going to be welcomed, it will be taken into account, and then we'll look at how we do that continuous improvement. We had our first family presence policy in 2009. It was modified in 2012. It was modified again in 2014. They were subtle changes, but they were changes that were important to the Patient Family Advisory Council, which means it was important to the organization, and they were important to the staff. The other lesson learned as we were implementing it, it was really important to have a decision-making framework to guide how things were done. We took the draft policy at one point to one group. It's unimportant which group it is. And when we took it to that group, we knew we were taking it to them for information and input. They thought it was going to them for approval, and they didn't approve it. So they thought they had the right of veto of that policy. So that created some turbulence in a moment where I think as you navigate change with anything, but certainly something on this scale, as it goes to groups, it needs to be very clear. What is their role as they are engaged in any role with that document? And again, it goes back to, we were not asking whether we would do this. We were convinced it was the right thing to do, so it was more how we were going to do it. And the last lesson was one that Cynthia raised when we spoke last week, and it was to recognize as you bring families in, and the point was made this morning, patients and families, there are some aspects of those interactions that need to differ, and one of the key ones was all of a sudden there's going to be unexpected crises unfold, and the family members are going to need a support that is different than when family presence wasn't supported. And you need to have that mechanism. Now, that wasn't very difficult to address as an after the fact, but it was one that we had not really given due consideration to at the outset. So hopefully all of this sort of helps identify that it can become, I think we agreed this morning, it's a necessary thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's a good thing to do. It becomes how you do it. And I can promise you from experience, you will never find that there is anything that will change the game of healthcare as you live it than supporting that, partnering with patients and families.
We're going to have a presentation from PEI focused in on getting to large-scale adoption of open family presence. And we have Sherry and Paul with us. So please join me in welcoming them.
It's great. Thank you very much. And again, thank you to CFHI for putting on this opportunity and this collaboration. It's been an absolutely terrific morning into the afternoon, and we're here today from PEI, myself and Sherry, to just share a little bit about our journey as we launched our family presence policy about 4 or 5 months ago. So I'll just provide a little overview for Health PEI. So Health PEI was established in 2009 as a Crown Corporation. It's a separate branch from government. Roles and responsibilities are defined in legislation, the Health Services Act, and the way we summarize that is the department makes the snowballs and Health PEI throws them. So this was one that everyone seemed to be on the right page, both at the departmental level and operations, when we started having discussions around family presence. PEI itself, just under about 150,000 residents, equally distributed, male, female, and high rates of chronic disease, of course, hypertension, diabetes, and COPD. Our org structure, again, we report directly to the department. We have a governance board that the CEO reports to, and under that we have 7 divisions within health. Those 4 of them with clinical portfolios are led by a clinical chief, and a physician lead, as well as a chief administrative officer, kind of lead those 4 clinical portfolios, and then the corporate quality at the bottom rung are just led by executive directors. Operations itself, about 4,700 employees, and across the island there are 6 hospitals. Specifically, myself and Sherry would be representing the community hospitals. There's 4 community hospitals and 2 larger centers. I work principally on the west side, and Sherry's on the east, so we're covering the island. And then, of course, there's a number of other sites, including the 9 public long-term care facilities, as well as a number of private long-term care facilities, and a number of community health sites. Our strategic direction was just affirmed last year, so we have a strat plan for 2017 through 2020. When we look at our vision of one island health system, supporting improved health for islanders, and then followed by our mission within our organization of working in partnership with islanders to support and promote health through the delivery of safe and quality healthcare. So certainly from that perspective, when you just kind of soak in what our mission is within Health PEI, patient and family-centered care is really embodied at that point. When we look specifically in our strat plan around quality and safety, it is further identified as key priorities: patient and family-centered care, patient experience, and family presence. And then that's further refined very specifically in our annual business plan, as it is this year as well, and has been for the last year. So as we kind of go through our journey, it really starts in 2014, a one-line email from our CEO just asking to consider reducing or limiting visiting hours and enhancing family practice. That was sent broadly to the management group, I think a little bit as a challenge, and that's where a lot of groups, some that already had this in place, some that were having some conversations, it really allowed us to start those discussions to where we are today. I think some of you have probably seen this before, and this was, I think, the initial reaction that we had in the province after that email. So we met with staff, and we shared in terms of where we're going and hoping for our vision. And you know, it's the OMG, this is going to be a free-for-all. And that's really, once we got that early feedback from staff, we knew that there'd be a lot of communication, a lot of education that was required. Something that was very doable, but again, that would require a robust plan. And certainly, how things have changed. There's a few of these that are pretty cute that we added in. You know, the evidence, and we've heard it directly from some of the staff surveys that we did initially, trying to get a handle, and I'll talk about that a little bit in terms of where we started. But we knew certainly that there were some beliefs that families really exhausted the patients, and that they were a stumbling block in care, and that there's concerns over the spread of infection. So we knew, and those were just anecdotal discussions that myself had with staff, and we heard about the system, that we would know we would have to ensure that we did our due diligence with our communication and our education. And here's another pretty cute one as well, as times have changed. So in terms of the background, So family presence practices in 2016 were being done in some units, some facilities across the province, and were implemented in long-term care within the province for several years. So as I mentioned earlier, there was certainly a good starting point in terms of knowledge and practices that were already within the province that gave us a good platform to start discussions. Health PEI, as embedded within the strat plan and was identified through our focus groups, put together a patient and family care steering committee that was established to strengthen the patient experience and build on a culture of patient and family-centered care. At that point, of course, all health PEI hospitals, 6 hospitals or 1 mental health hospital, as well as the provincial palliative care centers participated in this great initiative, the collaborative. And our goal at the end was to improve patient and family-centered care by March of 2017 by introducing a family presence policy and practices across health PEI that support partnerships in care with families and caregivers as defined by the patient. So we started. So we joined the collaborative at that point, and early on we established our implementation team. And we knew early on that this was one of the most critical junctures for our journey to begin. It was very important that we had the right folks around that table for the implementation. These needed to be key leaders within each of the respective areas. They needed to be champions, those that understood our vision and direction of where we need to go, how to accomplish what we need to do. We knew the vast importance of being sure that we had the right folks together to be able to pull this together, as well as pulling in together patient and family advisors. So we had 2 of them that participated in this initiative. And it's unfortunate that through timing, they weren't able to be here today. They were absolutely fantastic and instrumental as part of the process. A tremendous amount of healthcare experience, both from their professional backgrounds, and then as well they had a tremendous amount of experience, both good and bad, within the healthcare system, which was really critical. But certainly as we went through this journey, there were a number of challenges. I'll speak in sometimes I tend to simplify the success and our challenges as we went through this journey. But I think I attribute that to the momentum that I spoke to earlier, that as we started the discussions, there was an appetite both at our leadership level and frontline staff to be able to put something like this in place, and the timing was there. So having that feedback from our advisors and heavily engaged within the system, active volunteers within our system, it really helped to round out our team. We completed the assessment and review of any family presence policies or practices across our sites, including surveys to patients and families as well as staff. So we wanted to get a bit of a handle in terms of again, any policies that were out there. My site specifically, this was something that we had started working on a couple of years earlier. We had a draft policy together, something that both facilities were doing indirectly without any type structure or framework around it. So there was varying degrees of work, and as I mentioned, long-term care had these practices already embedded in a number of their facilities for quite a few years, so there was a great deal of experience for us to draw from. So we did some inventory across current signages within our facilities for visiting hours, a mixed bag in terms of varying degrees of visiting hours, very little formalization in terms of policy or practices, variations of some areas were making announcements, some were not making announcements, quiet hours varied from facility to facility. So once we had a handle of exactly where we are across the province, we knew where we wanted to go, and that was our goal, to establish standardized family presence practices throughout health PEI to enhance patient experience and improve the outcome. And certainly we knew that this, and having it aligned directly within our strategic plan for health PEI was key. It was certainly identified through the number of focus groups that we had leading up to the development of our strategic plan. It was certainly the voice of Islanders at that point was very clear that this was very important to them. And it was also identified that it was very important to staff. So we had clear support from our leadership and from government, as well as we had the voice of the communities behind this, and a number of practices that were already somewhat formulated within facilities, both within hospitals and in long-term care. So it really gave us a great platform just to take a deeper dive in terms of what we were doing and then further refine that. So we started with a draft policy, as I mentioned, within one of the hospitals, as well as there were a number of policies that were reviewed through an environmental scan across the country, as well as through the E-Collaborative. We collected regular feedback from all sites and incorporated into the draft policy. So the implementation team, which met consistently and regularly throughout the period of this project, at minimum monthly, there were a number of quick huddles and phone calls as well to continually update with successes and barriers and opportunities to provide that feedback into the policy. Certainly a lot of discussion in terms of defining family and partner in care, role clarity, as well as pet visitation or animal presence, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Ongoing communication and stakeholder engagement. So of course, as we heard this morning, that certainly is very key. We had a very robust, or what we would define as a very robust stakeholder and communication plan with every provincial group that we could get the opportunity to speak on their agenda, and we didn't have any resistance to that. We went across the province, and this would include our sponsor at the leadership level. So one of it was our CNO that has the patient experience component within our portfolio, went with the project team leads to their facilities in the early onset to talk about where are we going and what are we doing with this initiative, and to lay the groundwork and to address some of those challenges and perceived myths in the early onset. And the education materials as well. So I give certainly a lot of credit to Karen McCaffrey, who led this team and this piece of work, who really should be the one here today patting herself on the back. Great work from the team, but with this team, there was really great leadership. So she was instrumental in developing a lot of the educational materials with feedback from the team and the facilities. So there was continually numerous Q&As that were distributed and circulated. Posters, panel cards, scripts were developed to help support staff in communication with patients and families, as well as the educational presentations at the beginning and the early onset of the project, as well as when we got towards the implementation to again revisit some of the management groups across the province and ensure that we're providing those updates and the direction and the policy and answer questions and ensure that staff and the key leadership folks within the facilities have a good understanding of the policy. And we're able to communicate that information down to their teams and the frontline staff. And as well, so the implementation plan, which was reviewed monthly, we continually updated. So we had a segmented time that we addressed specifically any opportunities, the barriers that we were overcoming, timelines, and celebrate our successes, because there were a lot of successes that were being achieved throughout the duration of this project. And I think those small wins really helped fuel the momentum for this project to continue on through. And then in the final phase, so we had the policy finalized by our senior leadership group in January of 2017, and was disseminated and shared broadly in February of 2017. Again, we had a provincial roadshow with our key sponsor and leadership representation for Health PEI at any table that requested it. She was very willing and engaged, and I think we've seen lots of examples of that, of how important it is to have that participation and engagement at the senior leadership level. And I often reference that we had a really great top-down leadership approach to this, as well as a bottom-up leadership from frontline staff, that there was a strong appetite from the community and for staff to put a little bit of formalization around this, and then we met in the middle with this policy. The policy was created in such a way that it was broad enough to allow specific units or facilities to the flexibility to make it work for them. We think, which is one of the reasons why we had a fairly seamless early adoption, was from some of the legwork that was done with the policy and how it was created. So facilities then created their internal practices and implementation plans, and there's a number of facilities now that have their own patient experience or patient and family-centered care teams, specifically looking and reviewing their family presence and how to build upon that. One of our facilities, it just it's really inspired them to say, how can we do that much more for patients that come into a remote community? And one of our biggest challenges in talking with our patients is how to get their laundry done. They want to stay with their loved one. We feed them. We have shower accommodations, but one of the challenges was, how do we do that? So the staff worked and found a way to incorporate that within our laundry services so that without having a laundromat in the community, we now have the ability to, if you want to stay 24/7, and you may not have a large family to help support you, but you're there, we have processes in place that we can do your laundry now as well. So we've challenged staff to try and further refine and look at those opportunities that can enhance that patient experience. So internal communication and messaging, certainly from the website to a lot of the education materials that I spoke to, we had a lot of good news, media stories, those radio support. I think every avenue that we could consider how to communicate this change to our system, this change to our culture, and champion it. Because again, when we speak within the communities, a lot of Islanders were under the assumption they could do this and participate. So it was very important for us to know that how do we go about and further champion these practices. The Patient and Family Centered Steering Committee, which is now in place, will help with the monitoring of these policies and these practices, and address any barriers that will come up at the site level. Because again, as I mentioned, it's something that as a province, we're trying to continue to build upon. We continue to evaluate our measurement indicators, such as falls and medication rates. Early on, we looked at Q1 data, which just became available. No significantly noticeable trend at this point in terms of any reduction in falls or medication errors. But what we do know certainly is from our patient satisfaction results, from feedback within the communities, has been overwhelmingly positive. There was just one complaint that was registered, and it was actually from a staff member at a larger facility, that there was an evening where they felt there was a number of family members and visitors wandering about the halls. And I think it was more an issue related to security rather than a failure of the family presence policy, which was a good point that was made earlier. This was just a script that was identified to help with staff have some discussion points within their facilities to identify family and partners in care across the facilities. So certainly family and partners in care were anyone identified by the patient as important support. The family and partners in care were defined by the patient or substitute decision maker. The patient had the right to include or exclude certain people. We do not have a cap on the number of people. It was certainly something that was, there's a little bit of fear early on in terms of what should that number, 1, 2, 3 people, but we did not leave a cap to it. And 5 or 6 months into this practice, really haven't seen an issue in managing those numbers, or at least none that have been brought to our attention yet. Family and partners in care include but not limited to the immediate and extended family, friends, caregivers, and neighbors. And again, the number of people that are welcome to the bedside, and this was a really important aspect of it, that we just had really good communication between the patient, the family, partners in care, and the patient care team, and other patients in the room. So again, it's being mindful if you're in a semi-private room about other considerations. And as I mentioned, no issues that we've encountered to date. Pet visitation. So pet visitation, something else worth noting. So as I was mentioning to Sherry, we really shouldn't call that pet visitation. It's more pet or animal presence. And I'm not surprised in a lot of ways that I haven't heard that mentioned this morning as well, because we do have that incorporated within our family presence policy and practices across health PEI. And essentially what that is under consideration that certainly that an animal, and we say a pet, but I mean we've brought horses to patients as well, and if there is a way to do it, we'll try and find out that way. So it is something that was important to us to how we can consider that, but certainly those of us that do have an animal, they are a part of our family, and certainly how that can certainly contribute to further stress and anxiety from a patient being in the hospital without access to their animal or their pet, and to the other side of that, the benefits of having, if it's a cat or a dog or whoever it would be, by their side, particularly for palliative and end-of-life care, is very important. The policy, certainly, we had it noted that it was certainly applicable to everyone working within our health PI hospitals, long-term care facilities, and our provincial palliative care center. A patient experience story. So certainly this is just an example, one of many that we have. And again, that just continues to fuel why we have moved in this direction and continue to move on this. And I've said it a few times, we feel this momentum that is almost palpable within the province to build upon these type of stories of how important it is. So here's one that it was just a simple accommodation for Anna's husband to be with her in her final days, as well as her dog Bella. And that is something at some of our sites, at one of my community hospitals, we'd have 2 or 3 dogs on the unit on any given day. And Bella, this was a hard one for the staff. Bella never left the hospital, was there in the final hours. And again, as Anna passed, staff were actually not directly there, but they heard the dog whimpering. And then that's what prompted them to come in and support Anne through her passing. And again, then the dog would not leave for a significant period of time. So there was an opportunity to allow the animal to grieve, as well as her husband, and wait for their cue before continuing. So when we spoke to Bruce and his husband about sharing this story, it's something certainly that he was extremely proud to be able to share. And it's these examples that we want to continue to build on within an organization. In terms of barriers and challenges, there are always a couple that stood out, and this was actually a little bit of a more challenging exercise, as we talked about. A few of these, infection control, of course, is really limited to one facility, and it was pet visitation. So the important aspect of this was just engaging our sponsor and our leadership team to help facilitate some of those discussions. And having that support at the top leadership level was really, really valuable as we continue to move through this process and not be held back for any of these limitations. Determining how to implement this policy in other areas such as mental health and rehab. And again, that we did have someone, as I mentioned, our psychiatric hospital. We had membership as part of our implementation team. They were going through certainly some challenges in terms of how to make this work. And again, it was about having that engagement at the leadership level to help facilitate some of the more difficult discussions so that the implementation team could continue to move forward with the project. And then engaging a new security company in the process. So certainly security, there's a role to be informed and to participate in these types of processes. And we just negotiated with a new vendor in the province. So as that was being rolled out, engaging them in the process was a little troublesome at the time, but we were able to work through those challenges. Key facilitators, leadership support. Leadership support, engagement from leadership, engagement from our facilities, engagement from the team, and the dedication of the team. Again, these were champions. These are ones that really believed in it and would find a way to be able to overcome any of the facility-based challenges and work through those. No real major barriers were experienced. I almost feel like we should have something really significant to speak to, but we really don't.
Participation was probably our biggest barrier. Really, it was.
Yeah.
In all the meetings, that was the one thing that it took the longest.
Yeah. Always a few questions around distinction between family and partners in care versus visitors and entrants after hours, and just working with a script developed to support staff and helping patients identify their family and partners in care. And of course, change fatigue. So there's always a number of competing priorities for any implementation. But this one, again, because we didn't never feel we were reinventing the wheel or starting from scratch. We had a lot of discussion to hit the ground running. It really didn't. We didn't feel that impact. In terms of our successes, Health BEI, we did establish a family presence policy implemented at 7 hospitals across the province in February 2017. We feel we're quite satisfied with the education that was complete and rolled out across the province. And of course, continuing education doesn't stop. We need to continue with our education. We had good public communication at all sites, and through the media was also completed, as well as we presented at the Atlantic Health Quality Patient Safety Learning Exchange in May. As I mentioned, I think it was also inspiring that a number of hospitals created their own patient and family-centered care committees to continue to build upon the work within their facilities. One hospital implemented a shared stories, which was really neat to capture some of those very positive stories to help inspire and build upon and sustain this movement. And service providers outside the facility based family presence policy became very interested in consideration to how we can implement this in public health, how we can implement the family presence in primary care-based clinics. So that's, I think, continuing a number of discussions, and we'll propagate more discussions to come. So I think that's our journey to date. It's really was a fantastic experience through the collaborative. We really had a lot of fun with this project. And I think Christine mentioned that we're going to do some questions towards the end. So certainly we'd be glad to answer any questions.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for sharing. We will take questions, but we will wait until after New Brunswick's presentation. I just said Nova Scotia, but New Brunswick. So thank you so much for sharing. And now I invite Margaret forward to share New Brunswick's perspective.
Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for this invitation to share with you a bit of our experience in developing and introducing our family presence policy in New Brunswick. As some of you are aware, this quote that some of you might recognize from a video from the Cleveland Clinic was something that we used when we started just to talk about patient and family-centered care and talk about family presence within Horizon. Just to give you a bit of context, here's the map of New Brunswick, and it illustrates for you the geographical boundaries of Horizon, which comprises about 2/3 of our province, 12 acute care facilities, one a very, very large tertiary care center with about 450 beds, and then moving down to a very small rural facility of just 8 beds. So quite a diversity of urban and rural facilities across the organization, as well as health centers and many other public health offices. So we are certainly looking at a very broad breadth of geography. Additionally, I'll mention that the geographical difference is just one that we experience. Each facility also has somewhat its own culture. And so that was something that also became important when we were introducing our family presence policy. Back in 2014, we had a new CEO at the time, John McGarry, who joined Horizon, and within his mandate, he developed a new strategic plan. And you'll see here the vision of exceptional care, every person, every day, was something that he really embraced and wanted the organization to embrace. And additionally, he actually included as the first strategic direction of our organization that we would become an organization that was patient and family centered. And as I'll explain a bit later, that senior leadership endorsement has been extremely important with all of the initiatives, particularly family presence, that we had introduced. We certainly spoke a lot, just overall, around how we wanted to, I will say, illustrate the values are within Horizon, and some of this became a bit of the groundwork that we did as we moved toward talking about family presence. One of the first things that we did in Horizon was begin our Patient and Family Advisory Council. We had committed ourselves that we would not be introducing any initiatives centered toward patients and families without having engagement with them and having patient and families at the table. And so this definition of patient and family-centered care that you see here was one that was actually developed by our Patient and Family Council. And you will see specifically that they wanted included that family was as family is explained by the patient. And so they were very clear that this may or may not include blood relatives for them, and they wanted our organization to very clearly understand that. And so our family presence policy really became one of the first, I will say, areas of discussion within our overall patient and family-centered care strategy. It also was something that, fortunately for us, actually came up at our board of directors. In fact, our board chair at the time had had an experience where his wife had had some surgery, and the first night after her surgical episode, he had wanted to stay that night at her bedside, of course, in case she needed something through the night. And he was told about the visiting hours at the time and that particular policy. And so when I very first started mentioning family presence, he was one of the first people to say yes. He had been quite alarmed and honestly quite frustrated with the expectation that he would have to leave his wife's side after her surgery on that particular night. Again, this was a very, very good catalyst for us between the CEO and now the board chair, both really supporting family presence. It allowed us to have better senior executive buy-in early on, and our board chair was actually able, because of his own experience, to explain this to our board of directors. We talked, of course, about the reasons for family presence, many that we've already heard today, and we really emphasized these positive aspects, as well as some of the aspects that I think Eleanor and Angela had spoken about this morning around those statistics pertaining to a reduction in patient falls and reduction of pressure sores, many other statistics that are very positive in relation to this. And so what were the areas that we had for support? We definitely had a fully engaged leadership. We started to have discussions at directors' councils. Now, within Horizon, we're divided roughly into 5 zones, and each zone has their own directors' council, which is comprised of the senior directors or managers at those particular areas. And we just started to talk about this, to talk about the fact that, visiting hours were something that our patient and family council were telling us were a concern. We were talking a little bit about the impetus of what we knew was happening across North America, and the fact that Horizon was going to need to start really looking at this. And further to that, we started to conduct some focus groups. We conducted some focus groups with our staff members who were interested, as well as some of our other patient experience advisors, just to ask them about their thoughts around family presence, what would they like to see when we were developing a policy, and just to start to break the ground in this direction. And from that early outcome, we knew that we had some units that were already basically embracing family presence even without the formal policy. We knew that there were some early concerns that were brought to us around multiple visitors or about the need to reinforce some of the key principles. Additionally, we heard early on some concerns about safety and security, especially at night. And so we started to talk about the need for some identification that would become available for those that were in our facility at night and perhaps in a corridor, so a staff member would know that they had a legitimate reason to be in our facility. And so with some of those, I will say, early discussions, we actually began the policy development. And we had a number of individuals who came together both physically and then remotely by email to review a couple of drafts of the family presence policy. So a few of us took, I will say, the initial steps toward development of a draft, but then we made sure that we vetted this draft through a few people, asked for some good feedback, and then we made, a couple of revisions based on that. And those focus groups, as well as some of this input, helped as well to help our staff, as well as our patient experience advisors, to feel as though somehow they were really foundational to the creation of what we were going to be undertaking with this policy. And then we undertook some presentations about the fact that this was going to be a change in our culture, and that we knew we needed to really communicate through managers and supervisors down to our frontline staff. And we have a staff of approximately 12,000. As many of you would be aware, with large staff numbers, some of these staff are not those who are at a computer every day. And so there is always a challenge in how do you get that communication down to that frontline level, that frontline nurse, that, that housekeeper, the people who work in food services. And so we really talked about this and talked about the ways that we were going to need to include these individuals and make sure that when we completed the policy and when we were prepared with our education, that we found ways to really make sure that these people were going to be included. And so then, when we actually started to introduce the policy, we conducted interactive training sessions, not just by by webinar or by e-learning, but we made sure that we did a lot of this in person, because we recognized that we needed to be available in person to answer questions. And so we did that. We did that in a very deliberate way in each of our facilities and areas. We spoke to these directors' council groups. We also spoke to groups of nurse managers, but then we also held sessions on units with staff that were available. We had other general sessions that were available for any staff members that wanted to attend. And then publicly, we introduced this on our own website, but we also were able to engage the media. So we were able to have some information in our newspapers. We were able to actually have some television coverage. And so, we also worked on our brochure, and we had the brochures available on units. And from some of the feedback that we had received from our staff and some of these questions that were posed to us, we created a frequently asked question document. And we had this available for managers and supervisors as well as on our website. So if anyone had a question, they could, take a look at this document and find the answer to that question. And we also had, I will say this as a flexible document. So if anyone contacted us with a question that was posed to them perhaps and they didn't have the answer or it wasn't included in that FAQ document, we would add that to the FAQ document. So this became a living document. So anyone, particularly a manager that was speaking to their frontline staff about this, had something that was readily available to assist them to answer their questions. What were some of our lessons learned? It was interesting to hear our colleagues from PEI a moment ago talk about this pet visitation policy, because initially within our communication, we had included some information about pets and about pet visiting. We had already had a policy in Horizon about pet visiting as well as use of therapeutic animals. However, we found very clearly that, and quickly, that this was starting to get confusing, and we really needed to take family presence separate from anything pertaining to pets. And so that's what we did. We took the pet visitation information out of the brochures, and we also committed to staff that we would be back to talk about the pet visiting on a separate occasion, which we did, because it was generating some confusion, and we didn't want the impetus and the meaning behind family presence to somehow be overshadowed with any concern or questions around pets. The strong leadership support, again, was really important because there were a few challenges that arose, which I'll talk about in a minute. We also knew we couldn't just have our education sessions in a facility or in areas and then just back away. We had to go back and keep checking in. And so we committed, myself, Elizabeth, and a couple of others to, call these folks in these smaller facilities, email back with them after a couple of weeks. How's it going? What are you hearing? what's happening with your staff, so that we were getting some regular feedback around what the, I will say, what the feel was in the facilities, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, where the cultures were a little bit different. So we had some, particularly some smaller facilities where they were very open to this. We had some other smaller facilities that had security concerns because a couple of them did not have a 24-hour security guard, and the RCMP wasn't always accessible within 2 minutes. And so we knew we needed to go back and keep talking to them. After the policy was introduced, after we held some of this education and training and had the public education, then when we went back, we started to talk about the signage. And so we had developed signage that really was quite basic. We support family presence. Please respect quiet hours, and the quiet hours 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. Gradually, though, after we introduced the policy, we went back, started by removing all of those signs that were the obstacles and the, I will say some of those red and hands up barriers, removing all of those with the help from our signage network, and then gradually introducing this new signage. And then, of course, we asked for, units and areas to tell us about their success stories, and we started to hear those. And we started, when we went back, to ensure that those success stories were communicated and that staff understood what difference this was making for patients and family members. And we also continued to reiterate how closely aligned this was to quality of care and to patient safety. And so then, as I mentioned, we engaged again with staff on many occasions, and then based on some of the feedback we heard, we went back and tweaked some of our communication materials and used that as well. So we were very visibly listening to our staff, listening to the concerns, addressing them, and then tweaking the communication materials, I will say in association with that. And so what were some of the challenges? Within our large tertiary center, we have a number of our provincial programs. So our patients come to us from every corner of the province for some of these provincial services, for example, our cardiac surgery program. And for those individuals, of course, the family members are coming as well. They're very far from their homes, so obviously not able to return. And so, we had concerns expressed about, our family members are using patient washrooms. Family members are needing showers. Is this meant that it's going to be taking the, taking the expectation away that a family is going to need to, at some point, get a hotel room or a bed and breakfast to be able to actually rest properly? And so, these were some of the concerns that we've had to work through, making sure that families didn't just take over patient lounges for a few days in a row, that it meant that other families wouldn't be able to access them, to be able on a case-by-case basis to address some of those challenges. And then, as I mentioned, the security questions continue to arise from some of the smaller facilities. Mind you, there were no actual security incidents, but there were some of the concerns expressed. And we continue to reinforce with those that were in charge during overnights that what family presence is. In terms of that 1 or 2 individuals that were able to remain, not a large free-for-all. That if there was any episode of poor behavior, disrespectful behavior, some of the comments made earlier, that it's always within the purview of a manager to ask someone to leave, that this is not meant that we accept any type of behavior. So we continue to reinforce the leadership that we would still have and the responsibility that rests still with our managers. And so now we are continuing to liaise with our First Nations communities. We recognize, particularly as our elder had spoken about early this morning, the need to allow First Nations families and communities to gather, particularly during times when a patient is passing over. How do we accommodate that well? Typically, we try our best to have that patient in a private room, but we know that we still have a little ways to go in terms of actually embracing everything we should be doing to meet that cultural need. We also know that we need to continue to communicate and continue to hear the concerns so that we can address them appropriately. One of the things that we've now introduced is the understanding of family presence being presented when new staff are oriented as part of their new staff orientation program. And we're continuing to liaise with the critical care units, because critical care units continue to have some special challenges. For example, about the presence of children and how long children should be there, what should be some of the communication provided to children. What about when a patient needs to be resuscitated? How do we have those conversations about whether a family wants to remain when someone is being resuscitated or not? How to have those conversations on an individual level with family members of critically ill patients around what their expectations are, so that we can at least try to be flexible. So those questions and those, I will say, conversations are continuing. One thing I will say in closing is that family presence is a policy, but it's far more than that. It's a change in culture, and I think that's been brought out this morning as well. And so with any change in culture, you need to be in it for the long term, that this is something that you continue to need to work on for a few years before you can really feel as though this has become really, really embedded in your organization. So thank you.
So now, thank you very much. I'm going to get both teams to come forward, and then I'm going to go around with the mic. So any questions for either team? Don't all ask at once now. There we go.
This is a question I was going to ask Angela and Eleanor as well, but I'll ask you guys. So we're talking a lot about patient and family presence, sort of 24/7. What are the types of things that you've put in place? You touched upon them a little bit in New Brunswick, but what are the types of things you've put in place to support patient and family presence, like access to laundry and showers and beds in the room and things like that? I'm just curious if you can reflect on that.
I work in a community hospital, and we've always, we have cots, small beds available to put in the rooms if we can. We provide a meal for staff that are at the bedside. So we just call, or not staff, sorry, for family. So we'll call the kitchen and say, can you send up a family tray? And that, or it's usually just one tray, but letting them know. Sometimes we have, especially in the summer, you have tourists and people, the end of life, they have this dream to go to PEI and they're not well. And when they get to PEI, we've had instances where people have gotten very ill with us, and they've become palliative, and there's a family, a spouse with them, and we've let them hook up their camper to electricity. We let them come in and have showers and stuff, because this, and lots of times it's kind of their last wish to be there. We now have free Wi-Fi through all the hospitals, which has made a huge difference. And it's funny because you see all ages using the Wi-Fi. I've seen, seniors in their rooms with they have little tablets. I was walking by a room and I thought a gentleman was leaning down on the floor, and I thought he was falling. And I went in, but he had his tablet, and he was down there, but he was communicating with family off. So free Wi-Fi I think it's made a huge difference. And the only hospital in the province that actually, where you had to pay for parking, was our largest hospital in Charlottetown, the Queen Elizabeth. The government has taken that away now. So you don't have to pay for parking, which makes a huge difference. Yeah. It makes a huge difference, because for somebody to go in and visit, and if you have limited, income and that, and that if you're going to be there for the whole day, you're probably going to be charged like at least $10 or something like that. So that's a huge expense for people. So that's made a big difference for us, I think. So is there any other?
Oh, sorry. I'll just say that we haven't gone quite as far down that road. We have free Wi-Fi, but because of some of the challenges with introduction of the policy, we haven't gone so far as to say wholeheartedly we're always providing food or showers. We have some cots available in our facilities, but again, we don't promise every family member that they are going to have a cot. So right now, I will say basically, we tell family members they're responsible for themselves. And so they can certainly have a chair by the bed, a lounge chair if one's available, and a cot if that's available, and probably a blanket. But, otherwise than that, we don't promise them food. They need to be responsible for their own medications, and we don't promise everyone will have shower facilities. So I'm really pleased that PEI has gone further in that direction, but we're not quite there yet.
And it wouldn't be all the facilities. I just know from the facility I work at, but we're small. And I know with the Queen Elizabeth, they do provide cots for when they can, but it's a large facility, so they don't always have them. But I think it's the same in the Western. Yeah.
Hi, so in Manitoba, we're looking to have a provincial family presence policy, and one of the big things that we're looking for is to have consistency. So whether patients and families are in, one of the bigger facilities or a smaller rural one, that there's comparable experience. But we also know that there's a lot of differences in the way that facilities are run, and even within larger facilities between different units. So I was wondering if you could speak to how to balance having a consistency with also the need to tailor to different locations.
For us, we recognize there were, differences for sure with the size of facilities and the culture of the community. So when we introduced the policy, we talked about basic principles, but then we spoke specifically with that facility around what their specific challenges were, what they felt comfortable doing, where their discomforts were, and we tried to work through that. Although, as I say, we set out some basic principles. And so those were kind of the non-negotiables about what family presence had to be, including to be called family presence.
Yes, and I think that was one of the most important aspects for the island as well, was that flexibility for accommodation. A couple of the larger facilities in the province still have some parameters around visiting hours and some requests for quiet time, some announcements. A lot of the community hospitals, again, the flexibility within the team was how far could you go and what would make sense for your facility. So for our facilities, we were able to get rid of all signage related to visiting hours. For quite a few years, it didn't make a difference, right? Sunday morning at 10:30 after church, the church crowd came into the hospital. So whether we have visiting hours up or not, it wasn't really adhered to. So a lot of it was just, again, communicating with the public and the communities. And part of my role is monthly I would meet with the foundations and the auxiliaries and town councils and various interest groups and continue to bring that message as one of the key changers, as key discussion points. The further that we can educate the public to our practices, and as well as solicit feedback in terms of what would they like to see for other idea generations to further enhance patient experience. But the flexibility across our system is, I think, what allowed this to work with some of the larger centers that often the rural hospitals and what we like to do gets maybe silenced a little bit with some of the larger voices from the facilities. So having that variability and that flexibility within a broad policy gave us that ability to make it work for us.
Great, thank you. Did you have a question? I was wondering if you had any thoughts around budget implications. So as you talk about, I'll just order up one more tray, then there's food services. I mean, I don't know if you, to scale, then you look at facilities and your capital costs and planning for more beds and cots, and it just starts to roll out from there. Of course, I don't know, you think solutions on the other side, community churches would donate food, and right, but just that outset in policy, what's the news about cost?
That's a good point. And I think that's the opportunity, I guess, down the road for particularly the larger facilities. For some of our rural facilities, and I can speak specifically to mine, it was a great exercise for us to look in terms of our wastage. We had a lot of practices where there was a lot of food that was being wasted. So in terms of making sure we have a better understanding of who is in the facility, what the needs were, When we look at the cost differential from 2 years ago to now, it's for us, it's negligible. It's almost cost neutral in terms, but our wastage has declined significantly. So we tried to look at those opportunities to how we can meet a need and also address a problem at the same point. But I could certainly see challenges with larger facilities. I'm speaking from a 27-bed and a 13-bed facility. You know, the larger bed facility with larger numbers certainly be a challenge to do so. But again, I think that's the important part in looking in terms of what you can do individually in your respective areas, and not necessarily the organizational level, but again, back at the facility and champion some of those advantages. Because again, you know, being small creates a lot of challenges for us in a lot of respects, but there's a lot of opportunities within that as well.
Great. Any other questions?
I just have a question about the pet visitation for the folks from PEI. I think you're very brave to include that in your policy. I do have a question about it, though. Is it a case-by-case basis, or are there certain instances where it is restricted? So, for example, reptiles.
Sure. And so it is case-by-case. We did have a lot of discussion, of course, with infection control. It was really we were here, they were there, right, to meet in the middle. And part of the language, and it was in one of the slides, was that it would be considered more the exception than the rule. And that was to help satisfy and negotiate some of those discussions. And again, it's facility dependent. From a community hospital perspective, we've been doing it for many years. As I mentioned, last year we facilitated a horse just outside the hospital, but at a patient's room, that we made the accommodations to be able to do that. It was extremely meaningful. It was identified upon admission that they had a family horse, and there was a very strong connection there. So we wanted to try and make that work. Have we had reptiles? We have. But again, case by case, and there's been a turtle and there's been others, right? But it's a matter of an ongoing discussion based on the facility to see what would work. And again, the policy is designed that way to allow for a conversation, to allow for guidelines, to ensure that we're making good, safe, sound decisions, and the parameters are in place. But ultimately, it falls back to a discussion with staff.
Okay, this is a comment. I'm not sure how we can fix this, or I just wanted to say, out of the 8 weeks that I spent in 3 different facilities with my husband, probably the showering thing was the one thing I felt really guilty about. I always brought my own soap and my own stuff, and I never ate hospital food without paying for it, and so that wasn't the issue. And when my husband had a private room with a shower in it, of course I used that. But there were a few times where I had to go down to use the public, where they would bathe patients, and I always was respectful and careful to do it between 9 and 10 p.m. at night so that I wasn't taking time away from any patients. But I did feel bad about that, because I felt, and I would have gladly cleaned the shower myself, but I knew that it had a standard. And so even if any of you ever have input into new facility buildings, like even one shower in a public washroom, because there's always public washrooms, so I always used the public washrooms when I could. But
and that's what we've done in some of our
awesome.
Facilities as well, that we've gone to that point specifically to put a public shower or a bath in for those points mentioned specifically. And that's coming again from feedback from our patients, feedback from staff. And again, that's fairly new. And that came from a number of discussions that we've had over the last year and a half related to family presence. So as I mentioned, that has really started a next generation of discussions for us to see. Now the challenge is no idea is too small. Where can we go? Where can we go from it? And that's some of the ideas that have propagated and presented themselves, and we're finding a way to do that. And of course, there is a cost to that, but in terms of the difference that it's made for patients that have experienced it, there's a rationale there.
Great. Any other questions? How come I'm always in the wrong spot with the mic? Sorry.
Hi, back to the pets. Just because this came up last week, I was presenting to a group of community members, community stakeholders that give advice to our board. They're called local health involvement groups, and they specifically asked me about pets, and not, the therapy pets, but the pet visitation. And one of the comments made was, if I had a pet that was important to me and you allowed me to bring that in, what's the communication to the other patients in the facility that might be fearful or allergic. For example, if someone brought a reptile in, you'd be bringing the crash cart in right behind it, because I would be devastated. Do you tell me if someone else is bringing in a reptile? Or if I'm allergic to cats, how do I know there's one in the building? What's your communication strategy with the rest of your patients?
And again, I guess we're small enough, and I'll speak from it more specifically from the rural facilities. We feel we have a really good handle on the patients that are in our building. Again, most of the patients are well known to staff. They are mostly family, friends, neighbors. We know our patients very, very well. So we have ongoing discussion. If someone presented themselves with an interest upon admission, and we identify that, and it goes back to wanting to champion some of these practices. Do they have an animal that they would like to have some visitation or presence within the facility? And then that leads to discussions. We have discussions. We feel we have a good handle from having those discussions with our other patients around, do they have any allergies or sensitivities to pets? And all those discussions get factored in terms of how do we approach that, again, case by case. If they're in a semi-private, we do have some flexibility in our facilities to move them into a private. Maybe we look at other accommodations. There's been some examples where it did not work with a sensitivity with another patient in a semi-private. So we made specific arrangements for pet visitation in another space in the hospital. So again, the communication really starts upon admission with the patient, and that is with each patient in terms of what their interest is for pet visitation and any allergies there too. And then that's taken into consideration as we have new requests that come forward. Yeah. Now, what I can say is, well, we haven't had any issues in I guess the 13 years that I've been in health, and the 5 years and specifically that we've been bringing pets forward. We haven't had any complaint from family or friends or other patients in regards to pet visitation. What I will mention, we did have one little issue in the early onset of when we launched the policy in February. I believe one of the staff members that was resistant to it in March was bit by a dog in one of the large facilities, which didn't help the conversation. But anyhow, lots of discussion that is still going on within the province with specific to pet visitation, and surely will continue for quite some time. But again, there's lots of folks that are on both sides of that coin. You either can appreciate the relationship that you have with an animal, what impact that will have, and there's others. I know my brother is a great example that he just can't comprehend how someone can feel that that's a member of your family and that involvement. So we're trying to ensure that we're working to meet the needs without compromising or putting another patient or staff in a compromising or unsafe position.
And anyone who's looking for policy expertise on this, I know Alberta Children's Hospital has done this traditionally for a very long time and has quite a program set up, so you could potentially contact them as a good resource.
Hi, I had a question about how, I guess, free Wi-Fi and free parking, I guess mainly about how free Wi-Fi benefits patient well-being. And and I guess also how free parking would also contribute to patient well-being and also family well-being. I'm from a Native family, but we live in the city, so we don't have the benefit of the rest of the extended family. And so caring for my dad over 6.5 months, I guess in acute care hospital, was super taxing on us emotionally and financially. So I think looking back, free Wi-Fi would have been helpful for him because we didn't have other family there to take over for us. Maybe free parking would have been helpful in that respect as well. Another thing I noticed was that telephone, just regular telephone throughout the hospital was inconsistent. It was only in the surgical ward,
that he was able to call me with the assistance of care aides.
So can you maybe talk a little bit about how you decide which of those are the priorities and how you went about getting them to be free for everyone? And
well, it was a Health PI initiative, the free Wi-Fi. I know a community hospital in Surrey, a volunteer group, I think like the Lions Club or something like that, they actually provided the Wi-Fi at Surrey Hospital before it became a government initiative. But it's great for patients to Skype, you know, to family members that aren't here. They can speak to them and things like that.
In our circumstance at Horizon, we actually partnered with our foundations. And so what we were able to do is with their financial input for the Wi-Fi, then the homepage actually became the local homepage for the foundation. So it was also a way for the foundation to make contact with patient and families, and of course from there, hopefully increase their, uptake in terms of awareness and then subsequently donations. So the foundations were very keen to partner with us on that, and so that's how we've had our ongoing funding for the Wi-Fi. But the other thing I'll mention, aside, as you mentioned, with Skype, and of course the obvious ability for a family member, a patient, to be able to email, quickly with their own family. We had a lot of complaints from our patients that were in the oncology area. For example, a young patient that would be receiving chemotherapy and be there for a few hours, that maybe actually wanted to conduct some work while he was undergoing chemotherapy. Similarly, for our dialysis patients that are there for several hours, several times a week, for them to be able to have the ability to have Wi-Fi, aside from the entertainment value or just the basic communication. For some of them that work, it actually allowed them to keep connection with their jobs.
So I've just been thinking, spurred by Darlene's comment about the showers, but from a patient perspective, I'm just thinking of not just taking down the signage or changing the signage, but the importance of other signals that get sent to patients that their presence is something that is actually welcome, not just sort of the signage. So your comment about the shower, Darlene, made me think about kind of the internal dialogue of patients of not being in the way and not wanting to bother. And I had an experience with my brother when he was in palliative care, again, around showering. So that would have, if I stayed by his side for a week and a half, kind of 24 hours a day, leaving showering would have been a big thing. But there was a shower we were encouraged to use. We hesitated to use it, didn't want to take away from patients. When one of the nurses said, like, it's meant for this, and I can tell you, I'm not just telling that to make you feel better. Here's a basket of soap and toothpaste and things that they had donated by the community, just all those little hotel ones. Here's where we keep the hair dryer, because it's not the palliative patients who are drying their hair. Like, it's you guys. This is set up for you to use it. So we're not just saying this to make you feel better. I can show you. Like, it was a really small thing, but that always stuck with me, that they had hair dryers, And then the other thing I was thinking is kind of a before and after in your Horizon facility. You're in the regional in St. John. Having had experience with my dad around surgeries, the before and after the family presence policy, I now think, little things like locking the doors. So on some of the units, after a certain hour, the doors would lock. So you were allowed back in. That was clear. But if you wanted back in after 8:30, you had to flag down a nurse or grab somebody going by or bang on the door. And then that sets the whole dynamic as you're very, very sorry to have bothered them when they're already busy. Are you waking somebody up? So mentally, you don't do that. And now the doors aren't locked, so you can truly come and go. So just little tiny signals, I think, just to keep those in mind as you're implementing policies might make a big difference.
Absolutely, and that's a good point. And again, one of our facilities, the one specifically that we just put in the shower was for family. Another idea came up to that point specifically. So we're looking at, again, a carded system. We don't have security within the building, but again, trying to ensure that we have good security, secure access for staff, but again, not impeding the coming and going for families, especially in the areas that we're from. There's a very, very large families, again, like we heard today. So there's a lot of families that can only come in the later hours or early mornings. And again, the buzz-in, a nurse, and there may be only one RN on the floor, and that's well known within the community that there are very limited resources. So again, it's conscientious to know, well, if it's not open, I don't want to bug or take them away from somebody. So we're looking at a kind of a card system that again would go to those that are identified as partners in care, that they would have a card system that would allow them access to specific waypoints throughout the building.
Alrighty, one last question. Yep.
Thank you. I've got an observation and a question. It's regarding, my observation was the new staff orientation. You know, in the Yukon, in Whitehorse General for specifically, all staff, including the doctors, and all of the other support staff, are required to take, it's mandatory to take cross-cultural education. There's some courses that are provided for. It's not a long period of time. And the Hospital Corporation Board, Board of Governors are also required. It's mandatory to do that. It's not focused particularly on First Nations. It's broad, but it's primarily First Nations because we have agreements in place in the Yukon that require corporations, certain corporations, boards and committees, to have a guaranteed representation from the First Nations, and I guess that's where my question's coming from. There was an allusion on the previous slide about not even consultation, but liaising with First Nations. I'm wondering what that means from your perspective. Is it just passing along information, this is what we're doing, so you should know about it? Or are you inviting information back? Because the practice that we have invites, it's more than just inviting information back. I mean, it's everything from the cross-cultural training for people that come in and work in that hospital, all the way to how do we provide traditional medicine in addition to, you know, the type of treatment they're getting in the hospital.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
I can
Thank
mention that Horizon does have a fairly large First Nations liaison group that includes representatives from each of the First Nation communities. When we were embarking on the preparation of the family presence policy, we met with that group. Additionally, we actually were invited to go to some of the actual areas where the different First Nations communities were to talk with some of the residents about what they wanted to see included, what was important to them culturally. And so we tried our best to include that with some of the preparation of our education. We do have some cross-cultural education, not enough by far, for sure. But in subsequently going back and talking to the First Nations community since we've introduced family presence, what I realize is that there are still many members of the First Nations communities that aren't aware of the policy, that aren't aware of the change that we've introduced. And so now in discussion with a number and hearing some feedback, we're going to be working on some joint communication just to make sure that that can be more broadly communicated and I will say understood. And then you're right, very much so asking to hear what are the needs and what are the expectations. We do have a couple of specific nurse liaisons between First Nations and some of our facilities. They can be helpful. However, we want to hear directly from the population for sure.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. So, there you're off the hot seat. Let's give them a big round of applause.
So we're having a Wordle showed up. I have to ask what a Wordle was. Apparently it's a slide with lots of words on it. How unique is that? Darlene, you make it a very hard act to follow, and Christine is a very tough taskmaster. My job is to summarize the day in 10 minutes, so you'll have to bear with me. What I would ask you is, in your package there are a couple of documents. One of them looks like this. And another one looks like this, and the last one looks like this. And what these documents are, when Imagine responded to the document from CFHI about the Better Together work that they're doing, of course we were really, really excited. One of the things that becomes apparent though in this work is that there is actually quite a bit of material for organizations and for healthcare providers about how to do patient family-centered care, et cetera. what we felt was that there wasn't really a lot of stuff for patients and families. So if you were, not like Darlene, you'd been there for a long time, if you were new to this game, so what exactly is family presence? So a couple of colleagues and I drafted a couple of documents and then worked with Christine to do some, make it prettier. So what you have in your document is two things. The first document is to say families are more than visitors, they're partners in care. And this was intended to be left at the bedside so that if you had a patient and family who were interested in family presence, this might give them some idea of, well, what exactly do you mean by family presence and what exactly do you want me to do? So that's the purpose of this document. The second document was intended to be one step up, and that is if you're working with an advisory counselor, you want to go talk to the manager of the unit. Here's a little bit more information about what it might mean. So I would invite you to is if you want to provide some feedback on those two documents, please do. You can give it to myself or give it to Christine. If you want to use it, if you want to change it, whatever, you're welcome to use it. But the point was, we need some materials for patients and families as well as providers and organizations. Where's my Wordle? It's coming. It's coming. Okay. In the absence of that. So there's a few themes that really struck me. And one of the things that happens is the dynamic tension when you're trying to balance some conflicting demands. So we heard culture was a big part of it, and culture seemed to mean two things. It was the culture of the family to help the organization interpret the patient. It was also the culture of the organization, and both of those cultural issues are important. And context is a big part of that culture, both the context of the family and the patient, and the context in which the organization is working. That on the one hand, we want consistency, but then the other half of consistency is adaptability. So consistency means if you've got a policy that you don't have to depend on the goodwill of the nice nurse who lets you stay versus the nasty nurse who kicks you out because their visiting hours are over at 8. But in fact, there's a policy that says families are welcome. But then we need to balance that with the adaptability question. It's not one size fits all. It may be different policies or different practices that are needed for smaller or larger organizations, for rural versus urban. So again, we have this sort of this balancing act. On the one hand, culture and context. We have another balancing act between adaptability and consistency. Then we heard about the fears, that often when you're getting started, there's a lot of reasons why people don't think it should happen, but in fact, people who've done it have discovered that it's still, you didn't need to worry about those fears. It doesn't actually happen, but you do need to address them. You do need to recognize those risks. And that the enablers, we heard respect, communication, both internal within the organization and within the community. We heard the importance for education, both for organizations and healthcare providers, but also I would suspect for patients and families about their roles, and especially as advisors, whether it's on councils or committees or at the bedside. We also heard about leadership, and we know that that's really important to make things happen. The thing that I found very exciting when we talked about what this looks like, and that is the good news is it's good for patients and families, but it's also good for staff providers, it's also good for frontline staff, it's also good for organizations. So it's the ultimate win-win. We're all going to be winners if we get this right. And I loved the comment from Angela that if you really want patients and families to be partners, you have to let them in the door. I thought that was a really good place to start. The other thing that in closing was the notion about this isn't a one-shot deal. You don't just write the policy and then it's done. It's an ongoing conversation, ongoing work, ongoing activity. And the other thing is, it's a game changer. You don't asking if we're going to do it, you're going to ask how we're going to do it, and recognizing that this is we're in it for the long haul to make it happen.
So you've absolutely covered off a lot of what I had written down as well, Alex, but there were a couple things that really stood out for me. One of them was, holy crap, you can get your laundry done. Like, that was like, seriously? So that was a big one. As a patient advisor, the whole conversation about showers to me was really interesting, because as a patient advisor, my question in that meeting would be, do staff have showers? Don't know what the answer to that is, but that would be my question. So we can find room for showers for staff. Can we find room for showers for families? But, you know, just throwing that out there. some of the key messages as well that I really, the communication piece, but that ongoing education, that this just isn't going to just happen. This takes work. This takes thoughtfulness. This takes engagement. I heard about how foundational having all the stakeholders here, how important that is, how the value of hearing those patient stories and those patient perspectives and including that and making that an impetus for action. We can't just tell stories and not have anything happen. The stories have to motivate us to act. We have to be able to learn from those stories and see the opportunities to make change happen. And so, hearing how involved the patients and families were in all of these successful implementations is really, really powerful. And thank you for sharing all of that. And I also just, the piece around a policy is just a policy. And patients and family members don't necessarily read the policy. They don't necessarily even know the policy exists. In fact, a lot of staff don't know the policy exists. But they will feel how it's practiced. And so in this case, this is not a policy that goes in a binder and up on a shelf. This is a policy that has to be brought to life by the people who are doing the work and by the patients and families. And I really liked something Mallory said about it's everyone's responsibility to create that caring, quiet environment. And if we could partner and work together to make this happen, what an amazing thing that could be for healthcare. So we need that shared vision. We need that common purpose. We need that leadership and strategy to be out there. And we need the flexibility within our organizations and within our regions to make it work for us. Because there are different regions with different needs. And if we can share and find out how other people are doing this, what a great opportunity to not have to reinvent the wheel, for starters, but also just to find best practice. So this today has been really great to share that. And I love that we're going to all be together tomorrow to really continue to look at this in more depth, to really dig down and go deeper into how to apply this in your own situation, and to actually have some actionable next steps when you walk out of the door tomorrow to take back to your jurisdictions to change healthcare for the better for the patients and families that we all care about. So thank you so much to everyone who shared really personal stories, and to everyone who is talking about what are the challenges and how are we going to address them, and really starting to think about what are the solutions, and not, there was a lot of common ground here today, and that's pretty inspiring. So thank you for that. Christine?
Thank you both so much. This is, again, Angela and Alex as part of our steering committee. And I think it's a humbling exercise in ideas on paper, like an agenda on paper, versus living through 2.5 hours with no break. And so I think we've learned a little bit from that, and I hope to get you up and moving rather quickly. I'll keep it very brief. So thank you for your patience and your emotion today, and the sharing of stories, and participating fully. And one of the things that I'm hearing already is it would be really useful to have information and contact information specifically from the people in the room. And we're happy to facilitate that. I would like to say, if anyone has reservations about sharing their contact information, I direct you to Isabel, and she can make sure that we will not share that. And what we plan to do following this conference is that we'll put together the participant list with the contact information that we have, your emails. So I hope that the conversation continues in that way. And on that note, segueing into dinner tonight, as you're aware, we are hosting a dinner at Al's Steakhouse on Elgin Street. From the Alt Hotel, it's about a 15-minute walk, or a 5-minute cab ride. From Cartier Suites, it's a 5-minute walk or a 3-minute cab ride. I haven't checked the humidity. I don't know how hot it is, but please arrange to get yourself there with an appetite and being healthy and safe, so whatever is right for you. And then just quickly looking into tomorrow, one thing to note is that resources for day 1 are available online, and we're going to do our best to make day 2 resources available online through our Dropbox as well. So look for that from Isabel. And Angela has already sort of mentioned the idea of day 2 around really rolling up our sleeves, continuing to connect, thinking about how the information in the case studies might apply to your own jurisdictions, bringing that same degree of adaptation and flexibility.